Amish Widows Tears. Copyright 2024 by Samantha Price. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Remember ye not the former things, neither consider the things of old. Isaiah chapter 43 verse 18. The only thing Millie liked about winter's low temperatures was watching from the warmth of her living room as snowflakes fell outdoors. Especially when she was sipping hot apple cider in front of a crackling fire with a blanket wrapped about her shoulders. Unlike now, winter had thrown a white blanket over Millie's community in Lancaster County. It was bleak, bitingly cold and miserable. The flue from the fireplace downstairs ran through the second level of Millie's home and traveled behind the wall in her bedroom, warming it somewhat. Right now, as she lay in bed, the temperature outside or inside was the furthest thing from Millie's mind. All she wanted was for her labor to be over, and to be cradling her baby in her arms. She'd waited for this child for so long, more than just the 9 months of pregnancy. She and Joseph had waited many years to be blessed with a child. From her bed, Millie looked across at Meg, her mother-in-law. Catching her eye, Meg hurried over. "How are you feeling?" "Fine. I think. I'm not sure." Millie was between contractions now. She'd be anything but fine when the next crescendo racked her body. The midwife stood calmly at the window staring out, appearing more interested in the soft snowflakes falling than in Millie's labor. "How long now, do you think?" Meg wrung her hands as she walked over to Janet. Before the woman could answer, Millie felt the onset of another contraction and wailed before it came. Janet sprang into action, moving from the window and crossing to her bedside. "Breathe, Millie, like we practiced." Millie breathed all right, but not like they'd done before. The technique had fled her mind completely, and instead she breathed however she was able. The sensation passed after a few felt like forever moments, leaving her exhausted. "I can't do it anymore." In that moment, Millie wished she'd never met Joseph Hostetler. If she'd never met him, she wouldn't be in so much pain right now. "You'll need to." Meg shook her head, as though disappointed in Millie. "I can't go on. I need strong drugs, painkillers." She sat up and looked at Janet and pleaded, "Can't you do something? Call an ambulance. Take me to the hospital." In her calm and methodical manner, Janet said nothing. She merely pulled a small bottle out of her bag. "Stick out your tongue," she ordered as she hovered over Millie. "And keep this inside your mouth." "Herbs? What good would they be?" She needed something much stronger than that, but she had little strength to argue. Millie pushed herself up in the bed, closed her eyes, and opened her mouth, allowing the liquid herbal concoction to fall from the dropper onto her tongue. 3 foul-tasting droplets later, Millie closed her mouth. "Don't swallow," Janet ordered. Millie was at least pleased for the distraction. She lay back down on the bed, resting to gather strength for the next onslaught. Meg was no help in encouraging or soothing Millie, pacing up and down as she was. This is not how Millie imagined the birth of her first child. Joseph should have been there. He would have whispered words of encouragement while stroking her forehead. When he wasn't doing that, he would have fed her some more of those ice chips that sat untouched in the glass on the nightstand. Just him being there would have been enough. As Millie lay with the side of her face buried into her pillow, she heard Meg again. "Can she push soon?" It was another irritating way of Meg asking, "How long?" "She'll know when it's time." "Is it far off?" Meg asked, revealing her impatience more fully. Millie had heard enough of Meg's questions, and was just about to tell her so when she felt a change in her body. There was a different sort of pain, and along with it, a sudden urge to bear down. She heard herself moan from somewhere deep within, and she opened her mouth to allow it out. It wasn't even so much what was happening physically, she bellowed from mental anguish. The pain of losing her husband, her best friend, was unbearable, and up until now she'd suffered in silence. The more she yelled, the better she felt for letting it out. With each surge, she allowed her body to respond, pushing hard and working along with the contractions. 20 minutes later, the room rang with the broken cries of a brand new baby. Meg asked, "It's a girl?" The midwife ignored Meg and spoke to Millie. "It's a girl." The midwife wrapped the small baby in a soft blanket and laid her onto Millie's chest. Millie looked down at the rosy, wrinkled face of her baby, the pain of moments ago already a distant memory. This was her small miracle, her gift from God. She'd feared that there'd be something wrong, but there wasn't. The baby was alive and healthy. Everything was right. Except Joseph wasn't there. The conversation of the other two people in the room could have been somewhere in a distant world. Millie's surroundings faded into a gray background, the only light falling on the only person who mattered, the child in her arms. With Joseph gone, she had someone to love and someone who would love her in return. Meg's displeasure with having yet another granddaughter, her 9th one out of 11 grandchildren, was plain to see, but Millie didn't care. This baby was part of her and part of Joseph. It's a shame she'll have no brothers, and it's a shame my Jacob isn't here to see her. And it's a shame that Joseph isn't here, of course, Meg said. Millie didn't need to be reminded that Joseph and Joseph's father had died and would never see her baby. Meg moved closer and looked down at the baby, who opened her mouth and as though in protest yowled once more. I wonder if she'll have your pale blue eyes, Millie, or our side's dark eyes. We'll have to wait and see, Janet said. Most babies don't have their true eye color for a few weeks. As Millie talked softly to soothe her baby, Janet focused on Meg. Meg, can you boil us some water? What now? Yeah, we need it. Okay. When Meg walked out, Janet whispered to Millie, I thought you needed a quiet moment. Thank you. I do. Janet turned around to clean up, and Millie took the time to have that quiet moment with her precious child. She studied her tiny hands, pausing at each finger and each perfectly formed fingernail. Millie kissed the top of her baby's bald head. She was a marvel, and Millie refused to feel sorry for herself about Joseph. It was time to be strong for her baby. Joseph wasn't there, and she had to deal with it, so the baby wouldn't be affected by her sorrow. Hours later, Janet left, and then it was just Meg and Millie and the baby. I'll wake for the baby tonight so you can sleep, Meg said. There's no need. I'll have to feed her anyway. A couple of hours without food won't hurt her in these first few days. I know, but I'll wake you if I have to, Meg said. Meg was strong-willed, and sometimes she could be dogmatic, but this was one thing Millie intended to be adamant about. She'd waited for so long to have her baby in her arms, she never wanted her to leave her side. She'll stay here with me, Millie said firmly. Okay. Meg patted Millie on her shoulder. I'll keep an ear out for her cries. Thank you so much, Meg. Meg leaned down and kissed the top of Millie's head and looked closely at the baby. Joseph would have loved her. I know. I'll tell her all about him when she's old enough to understand. You did well, Millie. Millie smiled. Thank you. The next morning, Meg brought a tray of breakfast to Millie's room. Ah, Meg. This looks good. Did she wake last night? A couple of times. I fed her and she went right back to sleep. Ack, you should have called out to me. Meg peered into the crib at the sleeping baby. She'll be like a sister to Sue's girls. I'm so pleased that we've got girls so close together. Rosa is just a couple months older, and Sally is 3. 3 years is not that much older. Yeah, it seems your family has a lot of girls. No, Sue has 2 boys as well, only the younger 2 are girls. That's 50-50. It wasn't a time to argue, but Millie had learned a while ago to stand up for herself or Meg would take over completely. Meg had 9 children, and Joseph had been the youngest. His brothers had often joked that just like Joseph from the Bible, with the coat of many colors, he had been his parents' favorite. Millie didn't know if that was true or not, but nothing ever bothered Joseph, and she'd never seen him angry in all the years she'd known him. I know you wanted her to be a boy, Meg, but I'm pleased with my baby. She's my gift from God, Millie said. That's okay. Now let's see, I've got 11 grandchildren and only 2 are boys. With most of Meg's children owning farms, boys were the preferred option. Being a store owner, Joseph had been different from his brothers. He'd worked in groceries from the time he was 13 and really liked it. When he moved to Millie's community, he bought a rundown store and built it up. It had done well until a large supermarket opened close by. It still did okay, but after Joseph's sudden stroke that took him from her, Millie sold the store to Hank and Karen Fisher, members of their community. What will you call her? Millie knew that Meg had a lot of name suggestions, but Millie had kept her chosen names a secret. Joseph and I talked a lot about names, and we chose one for a boy and one for a girl. We chose Eva for a girl. Like Eve from the Bible? Adam and Eve. No, not Eve, it's Eva. Meg narrowed her eyes. That's not from the Bible. I know. Meg opened her mouth in shock and then slowly closed it. Millie knew Meg was holding back from saying what she really thought. But it didn't matter, because Millie's mind was made up and the name had already been decided. She giggled inside, thinking that Meg wasn't a biblical name either. Meg had come from Black Creek, quite a distance away, for Joseph's funeral and had stayed on with Millie, who was then in the early stages of pregnancy. Meg had helped her through the morning sickness, the tiredness and the heartburn. With Sue, Millie's sister and only living family member, being pregnant at the same time, she hadn't been able to offer much help. Without Meg, things would have been so much harder for Millie, and for that Millie was grateful. Chapter 2. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith. Galatians chapter 5 verse 22. Around 4 months after Eva was born, Millie left her alone with Meg. Eva was asleep and Meg was getting ready to go to a women's gathering hosted by Libby, the bishop's wife. Millie had slipped out to get a few items from the grocery store. A gust of wind swept over the buggy, rocking it and escalating Millie's heart rate. She pulled her coat higher around her neck to keep out the cold. It seemed there was a storm coming. It should have been warmer for this time of year, and Millie disliked the cold with a passion. She often dreamed about moving to a warmer climate, but knew she'd never do it. By the time she'd finished the 25-minute drive to the store, the wind had eased. She stepped out of the buggy, and while she secured her buggy to the post, she glanced across the road at the store Joseph used to own. Memories came flooding back. Her visits to the store always reminded her of days when her husband was alive, but then again most things reminded her of Joseph. She walked up the familiar steps and looked around for Hank, who was usually not far from the door. He was busy talking with a customer, and didn't look up when she walked in. Millie took hold of a grocery cart, placed her purse into it and started down the first row. It was then she realized she'd forgotten her shopping list. She hoped Meg wouldn't find it because she was always telling her she was too forgetful. It would just give Meg more fuel with which to give her some constructive criticism. Joseph would have just laughed at Millie's forgetfulness. He was always telling her she had her head in the clouds, and joked that one day she might forget she was married to him. Now his words were sad rather than amusing. Figuring she'd remember what she needed when she saw it, Millie walked down aisle 1 hoping that the needed items would jump out. She took hold of a pound of flour and 1 of sugar and placed them into the cart. Just when she rounded the corner, she caught sight of maple syrup and stopped the cart abruptly. Pain shot up her leg as someone ran into the back of her, pushing her into a display of 2-minute noodles at the end of the aisle. She managed to grab hold of the metal stand and save herself from falling to the floor, but in doing so she sent all the noodle packets flying. "Are you okay?" Millie heard a woman ask. "I didn't even see you." With one hand rubbing her leg, Millie looked up at the young woman who held a phone in one hand and a basket of groceries looped over her arm. "Yes, I'm fine." The woman turned around and disappeared, leaving Millie to pick up the mess. Millie stood and then pushed her cart to one side and crouched down to pick up the packets of noodles. Immediately, some strands of hair fell out of the front of her cap, covering her face. Her list wasn't the only thing she'd forgotten that morning. She'd also forgotten to pin back those pesky strands. Snatching up the 2-minute noodles, she snapped, "Get out of the way." Then she blew the hair away with a sharp exhale. "Who, me?" Through her disheveled hair she saw a pair of black boots. She followed the black trousers, the crisp white shirt and suspenders, until she focused on a smiling face. His dark hazel eyes crinkled at the corners, and the 2 dimples, 1 in each cheek, made the smiling stranger appear even more friendly. She smiled at him, and put down some noodle packages to push some of the unruly hair back under her cap, and then grabbed up the noodles again. "I'm sorry. I was just talking to myself. I bumped into all these and sent them flying." "You wanted yourself to get out of the way." She shook her head. "It's a long story. You see, the problem is that my hair grows in a most inconvenient way. It doesn't grow normally. It grows forward rather than back or sideways, and unless I pin it really carefully, it falls out of my cap." Now she was embarrassed, talking to a stranger about the direction her hair grew as though he'd care. She always said the first thing that came into her head when she was nervous. The way he was looking at her, she knew he liked the look of her. He was a stranger to these parts and must have thought she was a single woman, but she wasn't. Not exactly. She was a widow, and not looking for a husband. He didn't seem to mind her babbling, judging by his smile. Surely that's easily solved if you just pin it back? I do. I usually do, but I forgot today. She sighed. I was in a hurry. I've only got a limited amount of time to get a few things today. He crouched down. I'll get these for you and you can keep shopping. It's okay, I can do it. You're in a hurry, and besides, you'll put me out of a job. She stared at him, still in her crouched-over position. You work here? Unofficially. I'm staying with the Fishers and helping them out. She stood up and put the noodles back on the cardboard display while he did the same with the ones he'd collected. I'm David. Her head was blank. It was so long since she'd had to introduce herself that her name left her mind completely. Or maybe it was because the man in front of her was making her nervous, causing her to forget her own name. No, it had to be lack of sleep. His smile faded. Anyway, it was nice to meet you. Yeah. It was. It was nice to meet you, not me. Because? I know who I am. She wanted to slap herself up the side of her head. Why hadn't she stayed at home? When he frowned at her, she felt even more stupid. Same here. It was nice to meet you. Then he laughed and with a slight shake of his head said, Let's try this again. I'm David and you are? Millie. Hello, Millie. I'm guessing you live around here? They stared at one another, and he went to put one hand out to lean on the noodle display. Thinking better of that idea, he put his hand on the fixed metal shelves instead. I do. He looked over at her cart with the few items in it. Is that yours? It is. He nodded slightly. Let me know if you need any help with anything, Millie. I will. For sure I will. She stood there smiling at him, wishing she could have thought of something welcoming to say. Then he was gone. As she shopped some more, she was upset she didn't try to find out more about him. Meg would surely want to know about the new visitor in town. Meg liked to know everything, and she would be upset with Millie for not asking the right questions. Why was David staying at the Fishers? And how long would he be there? And the biggest question of all, was he married? Had his face been shaved? Already, she couldn't recall for sure until she remembered those dimples. He was clean-shaven, and for an Amish man that meant he wasn't married. Chapter 3. A merry heart doth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. Proverbs chapter 17 verse 22. When Millie had collected everything she wanted, she made her way to the cash register where David stood next to Hank. A clean-shaven David, she confirmed to herself when she saw him. Good afternoon, Millie. You've met David? Hank asked, rubbing the back of his neck. I did. When the 2-minute noodles collided with me. Both men chuckled. I'll have to move that display, David said. I'm sure it was only my clumsiness. I don't think it's in the way. It is in the way and you're not clumsy, David insisted. From the smile on David's face, she guessed he was interested in her, and that was confirmed when Hank looked from Millie to David and then cleared his throat loudly. Is this all for you today, Millie? Yeah, that's it, I hope. You see, I left my list at home. As Hank processed the groceries one by one, he asked, Has your visitor left yet? No, she's still here. I'm not sure when she's going home. It's nearly been a year already. Hank pinched his dark eyebrows together. I meant, has she already left to go to Libby's place for the latest afternoon? Karen left an hour ago. Oh, Millie felt awful for saying what she'd said about Meg. It sounded like she couldn't wait for her mother-in-law to leave. I thought you meant when is she going back to her community? Millie laughed at herself. She's waiting for me to get back so she can take the buggy. At that moment there was a crash, and then a squeal rang out from the back of the store. Hank excused himself and rushed to see what the problem was. David stepped in and finished processing Millie's order. Millie stepped back and saw someone else had knocked into the stand of noodles. Someone's fallen, I think. That's not good. She looked at David as he placed the items in the bag. You're remarkably calm in a crisis. He looked up at her with his dimples now showing again in his cheeks. Am I? Yeah. He looked back at the register. That'll be $58, please. She opened her purse and handed him $60, and he promptly handed her the change. You'd better help Hank back there, she said. I'll take your bags out for you. No need. Are you sure? Yeah. He took a couple of steps over and then came back and handed her the bags. She took hold of them and hurried out of the store. Now in a big hurry, she placed her bags down and untied the buggy reins instead of placing the bags in the back. Don't move a muscle, she ordered her horse as she realized she could have done things in a better order. After she placed the shopping in the back, she hurried back to take hold of the reins. She traveled back home thinking about the man with the dimples. When Millie got home, she saw she only had one bag when she remembered clearly that she'd taken two out of the store. She held her head. It was inconvenient that things like this kept happening. Had one lot fallen out of the buggy? No, not possible. Meg came bustling out of the front door. There you are? If I don't leave now, I'll be late. Eva's been fed and I've changed her diaper. Millie had to think fast. If Meg took the buggy, how would she get back to find the missing goods? Why don't I drive you? How will I get back? I'll come get you. Just call me. I'll listen out for the phone. Are you sure that won't be inconvenient? I don't need my glasses to drive, only for fine needlework. No, it's not about that. It was about her mother-in-law not finding out about her forgetfulness once again. She'd never hear the end of it. And worse, Meg might think it was a reason for her to stay living with her for longer. I'll get Eva. She'll like a ride in the buggy. She loves it. Okay. As long as we leave now, I don't care how we get there. She eyed her suspiciously. Did you get the groceries? Yeah, I did. Every last one. Millie bit her tongue. She hoped she'd gotten everything in that bag that she'd left somewhere. Meg exhaled deeply, showing her impatience. I saw the list you left on the kitchen table. Millie nodded and covered up her mistake with a beaming smile. Just as well, I have a good memory. You sit in the buggy and I'll fetch Eva. Okay. I might as well let you drive me. Once the baby was strapped in her seat, Millie climbed up next to Meg. So you got the vinegar and the baking soda too? I said I got it all. Don't worry. When Millie had gone inside to get Eva, she'd snatched up the list from the kitchen table and now it was tucked inside her sleeve. She'd get the missing items Meg had just mentioned and hopefully find the missing bag on the way. If all went to plan, Meg would never find out about her latest lapse of memory. A little further along, Millie was grateful when Meg finally talked about something else. I'll miss all these ladies when I go home. You'll see them again next time you visit. I was thinking of moving here. You and Eva need me. Oh Meg, that's so kind, but what about your children and all your grandchildren? They all need you too. And there's your big house. You've helped me out so much and I'll always be grateful. Now it's time you go back and be with the others who need you too. You think so? Yeah, I do. As much as I'd love you to stay with us forever, that would be selfish when so many other people need you. She glanced over at her mother-in-law and saw the concentration in her dark eyes. Why don't you move to Black Creek and be with all of Joseph's family? Eva can grow up with all her cousins and they'd all have so much fun. Millie looked back at the road. Moving away from Sue wasn't an option. My family is here. Sue's here. We've only got each other and I couldn't leave. And this is where I grew up. Eva will be raised alongside Sue's children. Meg lifted her chin and looked at the road ahead. It would be nice if we lived closer, wouldn't it? It's so sad to have you so far away and by yourself. I know you have Sue and her husband, but they have their own family and you have no one. We'll manage and we'll visit. Meg leaned closer. I hope you do and you're not just saying that. Millie gulped. She did not like traveling, and doing it with a baby would be worse. I'm happy you came here to help out. Stay as long as you want. I'm not trying to chase you away, but I can manage with things now. How much longer do you think you'll need me? I think I could manage if you were to leave now. I've got Sue close by and she and Malachi can help out in emergencies. How are you off for money? We'll be okay. Millie leased the many acres of land that had come with the house, and that covered her basic expenses. Things were tight and she had to be frugal, but they wouldn't starve. Are you sure? You can always move in with me if things get tough. Thank you. I appreciate the offer, but this is my home and I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. Joseph was happy here too, and I have the memories from our time together. Memories fade, Millie. I'm not saying that to be cruel, but you're young and don't know these things. One day you might meet another man who'll make your heart go pitter-patter. No. I won't. No one could ever replace him. They wouldn't replace him, but you might find yourself falling in love again, and that's not a bad thing. I'll think about that when it happens, or if it does. She knew better than to insist she'd never marry, because Meg would most likely insist that she would one day. As with most topics they discussed, Millie stayed on the fence. When the bishop's house appeared, they were both silent. Here we are? Millie turned into the driveway. Enjoy yourself with the ladies. Why don't you join us? It might do you good. No. Not today. Why not? Eva's had her sleep. She won't sleep again until tonight. I've got too many things I need to catch up on. Meg pressed her lips together. If you'd wake earlier in the morning, you wouldn't have so many things left unfinished. I know, but I like to sleep. Waking at 7 was lazy, according to Meg. It's not as though I work on a farm, and anyway, Eva's still sleeping when I get up. She pulled up the buggy near the house. Enjoy your work then, Millie. Are you coming in to say hello at least? It's too much to get Eva in and out of her seat. I'll come inside and say hello to everyone when I collect you. Meg got out of the buggy, and Millie waited until she was at the front door of the house before she left. What she felt when she drove away was relief. It was a good sign that Meg was talking about leaving. It would be lonely without her, but Millie wanted her own home back and was looking forward to a time when Meg was not offering her opinion about anything and everything. She had a feeling that Meg was longing to be back in her own home as well. Chapter 4. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. Psalms 1:1-2. To get back to the grocery store, Millie had to go past her house, and just as she was approaching it, she noticed a wagon heading up the narrow track that was her driveway. She pulled in and followed along behind, and then she saw it was David from the grocery store. He got out, turned around and waited for her. Hello. He held up her missing bag of groceries. Whoa, Silver. She stopped her horse, glanced around at Eva, who was still very much awake and happily looking around, and then climbed down from the buggy. Walking over to him, she said, Thank you. I was trying to figure out how I could have left them anywhere. It was out on the road. I noticed it when you drove away. She took it from him. Thank you for bringing it, but how did you know where I lived? The Fishers told me. That's right. She gave an embarrassed giggle. And then her baby yelled. He moved closer to the buggy and looked in. And this would be young Eva. That's right. The Fishers must have told you more than just where I live. That's right. They did. As the regulars come in, Hank tells me all about them. I'm afraid I have to go back to the store anyway, because there were a few things I needed to get but didn't. She pulled the list from under her sleeve and then rattled off the items she'd forgotten. Then she pushed it back into her sleeve and unbuckled the crying baby from her seat. Eva stopped wailing immediately, fascinated by David. She's lovely. How old? 17 weeks nearly. Is she your only? Yeah. I could get the rest of your shopping and bring it back to you to save you going out again. She laughed. It's fine. I couldn't put you to all that trouble. It's no bother. I've not got much to do with myself. Now was the time to learn more. He was being too friendly to be married, or even to have a woman in his life. Are you a relative of the Fishers? She asked. A friend. I met them a couple of years ago at my uncle's funeral. I heard about your husband, Millie, and I'm very sorry. She looked down. Thank you. I understand he once owned the grocery store. That's right. She swayed slowly, patting her baby on the back. He looked over at her house. Do you live here by yourself? I do, but my mother-in-law is staying with me. Ah, you mentioned her. I think she's ready to go back home. And home for her is? Black Creek. His eyes opened wide. No. Yeah. Why the surprised look? That's where I'm from. Is it? He nodded. She's not really from Black Creek proper. She lives in a small community nearby that no one's heard of. That's why it's easier to say Black Creek. Everyone here knows that community as Black Creek. What's her name? Meg Hostetler. He stared at her. I know Meg. Ah, so Joseph Hostetler was your husband? That's right. The same Joseph Hostetler who owned the Fisher's store. Didn't Hank tell you that? He shook his head. That's not an uncommon name. I didn't know he was the Joseph Hostetler from Black Creek. I grew up with him. My older brothers were particularly good friends with him. It seems everybody knows everybody. Yeah, except I didn't know you until today. Then there was silence between them. Millie said, I could have saved you a trip if you'd left a little later. I've got to go back to the store now. I had to take my mother-in-law to afternoon tea at the bishop's house. Yeah, I heard you say that before. Well, I might see you again sometime, he said. I'm heading back to the store now. I have to run some errands for Hank. Perhaps I'll see you again at the Sunday meeting. When she nodded, he said goodbye and jumped into his wagon. When he drove past her, she was strapping Eva back into her seat. It was very nice to meet you, Millie. She looked up. And you too, David. She got into the buggy and watched him head in the opposite direction. Halfway to the store, Millie turned around and looked at Eva, who had just fallen asleep again. The movement of the buggy almost always lulled her to sleep. Millie then realized how hard it would be to shop with Eva and with an armful of groceries. Since Sue's house was close, she stopped by her sister's house to leave Eva with her. Leaving Eva in the buggy for a moment, she headed to the front door. It opened and Sue stood there smiling. Hello. Hi. Could you look after Eva for a few minutes? I just need to get a couple things from the store. Of course, sure. She narrowed her eyes and stared into Millie's face. Why do you look so flustered? Your cheeks are bright red. Millie touched her cheeks and felt that they were hot. She hoped they hadn't been like that when she'd been talking to David. I have something to tell you when I get back. Tell me now. She shook her head. Later. Okay. Don't be long. I can't wait. She passed over Eva, who was just waking up. When she got to the store, Hank was by the register. Hello, Hank. Was that person badly hurt today? The one who ran into the noodles? She just got a couple of small bruises, I'm sure. Nothing to worry about. We moved that display, though. She laughed. Good idea. How long is your visitor staying with you? Who, David? She nodded. A few weeks, I'd say. And that was all he said. Hank was a talker, so Millie had hoped he'd be a little more chatty and tell her more. Perhaps Meg would hear some gossip about David at her afternoon tea with the ladies. Surely someone would mention David to Meg since they lived in the same community. Do you realize he's from Black Creek, the same as Meg? No. That's right. Meg's from Black Creek, isn't she? I didn't make the connection. Millie nodded. He still didn't tell her anything about David. Anyway, I'm back to get a few things I'd forgotten. Okay. As Millie headed down each row, she couldn't help thinking about David. Since Joseph had been gone, 3 widows in the community who'd married again had told her she'd find room in her heart to love again. She'd always seen that as something to worry about in the distant future, but wanted Eva to have siblings. Millie was well aware she was nearly 30, and that meant her childbearing days were getting fewer. For a moment, she let her imagination take over. If she married David, Eva could grow up with a father and be like all the other children in the community. Had God found Millie a nice caring man and sent him there just for her? And was it a sign from God that she met David in Joseph's old store, and another sign that he was from Black Creek? Chapter 5. And ye now therefore have sorrow, but I will see you again, and your heart shall rejoice. And your joy no man taketh from you. John chapter 16 verse 22. Millie arrived at Sue's house with a double sponge cake with jam and cream that she'd bought from the bakery on the way. She pushed the door open and kept quiet, not knowing if Sue's children might be taking a nap. The two older boys would still be at school. Millie walked past her baby and Rosa, Sue's youngest, both asleep on the rug in the living room, and headed to the kitchen where she found Sue and Sally, Sue's 3-year-old. "Aunt Millie," Sally squealed. "Be quiet. You'll wake the little ones," Sue whispered. Millie walked over and hugged her niece. "Hello, Sally. Are you being a good girl and looking after your baby sister and your cousin?" "No, Auntie, I'm not allowed to go near them. They're asleep." "Ah, I see. You're being very good by being quiet, good girl." "You brought cake?" Sue asked. "I did." She passed the box to Sue. "Lovely. Sit down and you can tell me all your news. I'll need a cup of hot tea to go with that cake." "Coming right up. The water's already boiled." Sue filled a teapot and set it on the table with 2 teacups. "You can pour while I cut the cake." That was good timing. "I knew you weren't going to be that long." When they all had cake in front of them, Sue sat down. "Well, what's your news? You know how you're always saying I'll meet someone?" She looked at Sally, leaned over and whispered to Sue, "A man." "Yeah. I did today." Sue's hazel eyes widened. "Who?" "He was working at the store. He's staying with the Fishers." She frowned. "What's his name?" "David." "How old is he?" "I don't know. Probably the same age as me or a little older. And what's more, he comes from the same community as Meg." "Really?" Sue's eyebrows nearly flew to the edge of her prayer cap. "That's so far away." "I know. What did Meg say about him?" "I don't know. She doesn't know yet. She's at the bishop's place right now having afternoon tea with Libby and the ladies to discuss their next charity event. You have to find out everything she knows about him." "I know. I can't wait to find out about him." Guilt washed over Millie. It seemed wrong to be interested in another man. "I know that look." Millie looked up at her sister. "What look?" Sue rolled her eyes. "Snap out of it. He's gone and he's not coming back. You can't live alone for the rest of your life." "I can if I want to." "Yeah, but do you want to?" Millie sighed. "I feel I should out of respect for Joseph, but the truth is I don't like to be alone. Or maybe I'll like it when Meg goes. Eva is with me, so we'll have each other. It's nothing to do with respect. Besides, Joseph would want you to be happy. He'd feel dreadful if he knew how wretched you are right now. And having children just makes you need a man all the more. I don't know if that's... And look at that big house you've got. Who's going to look after that? Houses constantly need repair. Do you always want to rely on others?" "Well, no, but I could learn to do a lot of that stuff myself. It can't be that hard." She swept a hand through the air to dismiss that topic. "Hopefully this man could change things for me. He looked so kind and he spoke so softly." "You've got it bad." Sue threw her head back and laughed. "No. I shouldn't have told you." Millie giggled at her sister. It was as though they were teenagers again. "I don't know the first thing about him. He could be married for all I know." Sue shook her head. "If he was married, he wouldn't be here by himself, would he?" "That's true. And he'd have a beard, and he probably wouldn't have gone out of his way to bring me those groceries." "What groceries?" "I left them outside the store and he found out where I lived and brought them to me." A smile beamed on Sue's face. "He's attracted to you and you know it. I can tell from what you told me." "I don't know. That life is so far behind me." "What life?" "The one where I was single. I've been married, Well, I was married for so long that I've forgotten what it was like to be single and looking for a man. I suppose you could say I'm single now, but I certainly don't feel it. You've got to get past that. You need someone, and this man might be perfect for you. Give him a chance. Millie giggled. I guess I could do that. I have to get to know him better, of course, though. I mean, I might not like him, or he might not like me if we see more of one another. Judging by the look on your face, I reckon I know how things will turn out, Sue said. Millie sighed, thinking of David's dimples. There's just something about him. It took me by surprise. I feel something, and I never saw that happening. I'll find out what I can about him, and then we'll go from there. What do you mean? You need help. And I'm just the person to give it to you. I can't wait to see him on Sunday. Millie rubbed her forehead. Don't make it obvious that you're looking at him. Of course I won't. I know what to do. Excuse me, Mom, can I have a drink of water? Sally asked. Millie looked at Sally, quite forgetting that her niece was sitting at the table with them. Of course you can. Sue sprang to her feet. And I'll cut some more cake for all of us. Goody. Sally clapped her hands and the women laughed. I better not stay too long. Meg said she'd call me when she was finished. And I certainly can't hear the phone from my barn all the way over here. Why don't you stop by and collect her on your way back? If she's not ready, I'll have to join them until they're finished. Millie's nose crinkled, not liking to sit around talking all day. I'll be stuck there while they talk about things I have no interest in. Sue laughed. I know what you mean, but if you go, you might hear about this new man, and who knows what you might learn. That's true. I'll go as soon as I have that second piece of cake. Coming up. For the rest of her visit, Sue and Millie talked about other things, and just in perfect timing, Eva woke up as soon as Millie had finished that second piece of cake. Millie got to the bishop's house only to find out that someone had already driven Meg home. That wasn't good. She knew she'd arrive home to a cranky Meg because Millie hadn't been home to hear the phone in the barn. It was bad enough that Meg already saw her as tardy and forgetful. And how would she explain that extra shopping bag in the buggy? When she pulled up outside the house, Meg came hurrying out. Millie, where have you been? I was worried about you. I'm sorry. I was at Sue's, and then I went to Libby's looking for you. I thought the afternoon tea would still be on. No, it was canceled. Canceled? They didn't tell me that. Why? Libby was ill. She was still trying to serve us all afternoon tea, but we told her to go to bed, and then we all decided it was best we go home. Sylvia Miller brought me home. That was good of her. It was. She stayed a while. We had a good conversation. That's nice. We talked about you. Millie stepped down from the buggy. About me. That's right. I told her that you said I should go back to Black Creek. Oh. I didn't exactly say that you should go home. I just said that I think I'll be okay by myself from now on. I'm not saying it in a bad way. I told her you said you'd be okay to manage by yourself, and she said that she thinks you should marry again. That way I wouldn't have to worry about you. It was odd to discuss such things with Joseph's mother, and it was stranger still that she was the one to raise the subject. It's not as easy as it sounds. Anyway, no one can ever replace him. No one ever would. Meg stood there waiting for Millie to speak. I can't just go to the store and pick myself up a husband. She gulped. The store was where she'd just met David. And speaking of the store, Meg had just seen the box of groceries in the back of the buggy. Did you forget to take that shopping inside earlier? Millie hung her head, summoned courage, and then looked up at Meg. I have something to confess. I forgot my list, and then I got some things, and then I left one of the boxes by the roadside. I had to go back a second time to get things I'd forgotten as well. Just when Millie was deliberating on mentioning she'd met a man from Meg's community, Eva cried. Meg opened the buggy door. I'll take Eva inside while you unhitch the buggy. I've got to get her in from the cold. Oh yes. Of course. And then I'll start us another fire. Millie would miss the little things Meg did for her. It was nice to have somebody about the place, somebody to share the workload. That extra pair of hands. Things were certainly easier now that Eva was a little older, but Millie knew she'd miss Meg in all kinds of ways when she left. Chapter 6. Casting all your care upon him. For he careth for you. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 7. It was over dinner that night when Millie tried to find out what she could about David. I met a man today who's staying with the Fishers. He was at the store. An Englisher? No. He said he's from your community. He knows you and his older brother grew up with your sons. And does this man have a name? David I forget his last name. Oh Millie, you really should try to be more. She shook her head. Wait. I'm sure he didn't tell me his last name. He just said David. He said he knew Joseph, and he said that his older brother was friends with Joseph. I wonder if it's David Weir, one of Ruth and Ephraim's sons? Is his older brother Abraham? I don't know. He didn't say. That must be him. There aren't that many families in our community, and the Weir boys grew up with mine. I wonder what David's doing here. He left the community a while back. He's back now if he left. No, I didn't mean left in that way. He went north to help Abraham start a community. I wonder what he's doing here. Meg repeated as she tapped her chin. I don't know. I only talked with him briefly and he didn't say. I'm guessing you'd like to speak with him and find out what's going on in your community since you left. I know everything. Paula tells me in her letters. At least 2 letters a week arrived from Meg's best friend Paula Zook. The letters went on for pages and pages and Meg sent long letters back. Millie had no idea how they had so much to write about. They must have known all the intimate details of one another's lives and the lives of those around them. I suppose we'll see him on Sunday. Yeah. I guess we will. At the Sunday morning meeting, Millie took her seat beside Meg, who had Eva asleep in her arms. There was no David anywhere to be seen and the Fishers were already there. As everyone took their seats, Millie kept looking around and there was no sign of him. Millie knew Meg had noticed her looking when Meg asked, I wonder where your new friend is. Millie's cheeks burned with embarrassment, and she felt even worse a second later when Hilda, the local gossip, turned around and looked at her. Who's your new friend, Millie? No one really? She wished that her mother-in-law had forgotten about David. It might have been better if she hadn't mentioned him. It didn't sound like no one. Are we getting a visitor? Millie was saved when the bishop stood to open the meeting in prayer. When the meeting was over, Millie wasted no time in moving away from Hilda before any more questions could be asked. Meg stayed close by Millie's side. Unfortunately, Meg hadn't forgotten about David. I wonder why David didn't come to the meeting, Meg said, looking around. I don't know. I was looking forward to seeing him again and finding out a few things from him. Maybe he wasn't feeling well or something. There's Hank. I'll ask him. No, don't. Her mother-in-law stopped in her tracks. Why not? It might look like you're checking up on him or something. Like, why wasn't he at the meeting? Nobody's going to think that. You don't think so? No. I don't. You would think that? Millie gave up at that point, and regretted ever telling her about David. Okay. Don't mind me. It was just, never mind. I won't talk to Hank, I'll talk to Karen. Before Millie could say anything else, Meg scurried toward Karen. Where's she going so fast? Millie turned to see Sue holding her sleeping baby. She's off to find out why David isn't here today. He's probably gone home already. Oh, that's sad. Well, I don't know if he has. She'll find out soon enough, don't worry. I wasn't worried. Or maybe I'm worried about Meg. I just don't know what she's going to say. I hope she doesn't say I was talking about him, or asking about him. Relax. No one knows you like him. I met him yesterday at the store, Sue said. She narrowed her eyes at Sue. You went to the store? Yeah. You never shop there. You told me you always go to the supermarket. I wanted to meet him, Sue said. I hope you didn't mention me. No, but I did invite him to our house for dinner on Wednesday night. Millie gasped. No. Well, what did he say? He was wavering until I told him I also invited you and Meg. Millie shook her head. You shouldn't have. I did. It's been a while since I've seen you truly happy, and I want to see you married again. His face glowed when I said your name. Is that right? Yeah. You will come for dinner, won't you? I'll have to, now that you told him I would. Good. Millie looked around nervously, and was thankful the community's worst gossip was now interrogating someone else. Then she noticed Meg hadn't talked with Karen for long. Meg hadn't returned, and that told Millie she hadn't learned much about David. I'm sure Meg and David will have a lot to talk about. Millie wondered what was so important that it had taken David away from the Sunday meeting. It wasn't until Meg and Millie were on their way home from the meeting that Meg once again brought up the subject of David. You're never going to believe what I found out about David. What's that? It is David Weir, the man I thought he was. I wasn't able to find out anything other than he was staying with the Fishers, and you already knew that. Neither Hank or Karen told me why he was there. That's odd. I think so. Why is he here so far from home? There must be a reason. We'll find out more on Wednesday because Sue invited him and us to dinner. Is that right? Yeah. Good. I managed to find out from Libby that he went somewhere else today, and he'll be back at the Fisher's place the day after tomorrow. In time for Wednesday night's dinner. It'll be interesting to hear why he's here. He hasn't got any relatives in this community. Millie tried to act as uninterested as possible. It must have worked because Meg went on to talk about something else. Chapter 7. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Romans chapter 12 verse 18. On Wednesday morning, Millie went to Sue's place to see if her sister needed help with the dinner. Meg had insisted on Millie leaving Eva with her. I'm nervous about tonight, Millie confessed to Sue. There's nothing to be worried about. Seriously. What am I doing? I can't believe I'm actually thinking about another man at this time. It's been long enough, and you said you were lonely. It's not been long. It's only been a year. I never expected to meet anyone. Not this soon. I would be lonelier if Meg wasn't around. I'm conflicted. Millie sighed. Why was life so hard sometimes? All I want is to go back in time, and for the tragedy to never have happened. He was plucked away from me without warning. Sue swung around and grabbed Millie by the shoulders. It has happened, and you have to realize that it has, and he's not coming back. What you had is gone, and right now it's about making a new life for yourself and Eva. You have to think about both your futures. Do you want to be alone? No, I don't. Millie didn't want to agree with her sister. What she really wanted was for Joseph to still be alive. What you're doing tonight is getting to know David better. That's all. You don't have to marry him, but it's a step in the right direction. Millie giggled. I know I don't have to marry him, silly. She pushed Sue's shoulder playfully, making Sue giggle. It's just that thinking about the whole thing and entertaining the thought of marrying again makes me feel weird. It doesn't seem right. Stop thinking about things that much. That's what you always do. Let things happen the way they're meant. Peel those potatoes over there. Millie turned to face the countertop behind her, and walked over to the mountain of potatoes balanced there. Just don't do anything to embarrass me tonight, okay? Of course I won't. He's a visitor to this community, so we're just being friendly. Millie picked up a potato and the peeling knife. Good. As she peeled, she couldn't help wondering what Joseph would think about David. Would Joseph have married again if she had been the one who died? Would he have been attracted to a new woman so soon after her death? It was uncomfortable thinking of such things. She'd want Joseph to be happy for sure if he'd been the one left behind, but she wouldn't want to be forgotten. Later that night, Millie was embarrassed when she found herself seated directly opposite David. When he kept looking up and smiling at her and paying her special attention, she knew he liked her and she was flattered. What she couldn't work out was, with his looks and friendly personality, why wasn't the man married already? "Where's Eva?" he asked. "She's asleep." It was Sue's husband Malachi, who kicked off the conversation once everybody had filled their plates and given their thanks to God for the food. "So David, what kind of work do you do?" "I do a bit of everything. A bit of this, a bit of that. Mostly I work construction. Building is what I like best." Sue said, "That's good because Millie has a lot of house repairs that need doing." Millie sat there embarrassed and looked at Sue, who'd promised her that the dinner wouldn't be like this. Sue didn't even look at her. Instead, she kept staring at David, waiting for his response. Millie cleared her throat when she saw David smiling at her. "That's not quite right." "I don't. Anyway, I'm sure David doesn't want to do boring house repairs while he's visiting. I'm sure the Fishers have him occupied enough." "I have plenty of time. What kind of things need repair?" Before she had a chance to say there was nothing, Malachi got in before her. "I've been meaning to get over there." "I'm sorry, but it wasn't anything urgent, was it, Millie?" "No, it wasn't." "I'd be happy to help you with whatever you need," David said. Sue spoke again. "She's always complaining about the window in the living room, especially in the cold." "What's wrong with the window?" he asked Millie. She shook her head vigorously and then regretted it as strands of hair slipped in front of her face. As her hand moved to push those strands back under her cap, she insisted, "Nothing really." Meg placed her knife and fork down on her plate. "It's just that the air whistles through when the winds are coming from the south and west. It can get quite chilly." "I would." Sue elbowed her husband, and he didn't finish what he was about to say. Now Millie was even more uncomfortable. David would know it was a setup by now. Judging by his wide grin, he knew, and he didn't seem to mind. "I'll stop by and have a look at it tomorrow and see what's going on." Millie shook her head. "No, David. I couldn't bother you with something as small as that." "There are other things at her place that need doing," Sue added. Millie glared at her. Sue saw her staring. "Well, there are, Millie. Every house has a list of things that need this or that hammering. A nail or two here or there. Nothing that I can't do." Millie cut a piece of chicken and popped it into her mouth. "How about I come take a look at the window tomorrow morning?" Millie swallowed her mouthful and her pride. "Thank you, I would appreciate that very much." She knew even if she protested further, Sue would not let the subject go. "I'm trying to remember the last time you were home," Meg said to David. "I was there just before I came here." "And the time before that?" He chuckled. "I can't remember. It was a long time ago." "You went up north, as I remember." "That's right. But you didn't stay there long, did you?" "Excuse me, Meg, could you pass me some of the mashed potatoes?" Millie tried to break up the questions. Meg was getting far too inquisitive. "It was a long time ago, Meg. It's going back years now." "It's not that long ago, not to me." Sue said, "As we get older, the time seems to move faster." "That's right, and the years pass quicker," Malachi added. Right after dessert, Millie said it was time to go home. She made the excuse that Eva was crying and fussing because she was teething. It was true, but it was also a good reason to stop any more embarrassment that might come her way. It was bad enough that David had felt obliged to promise a house repair for her. If things were to develop between her and David, she'd wanted it to happen naturally, not to be forced. Chapter 8. Now the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, that ye may abound in hope, through the power of the Holy Ghost. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. The next day, Meg had strategically decided to visit Sylvia Miller just before David was due to arrive to fix the window. Millie was putting Eva down for a nap when she heard a buggy. Looking out the window, she saw the Fishers' dark bay gelding drawing the buggy. Millie had already dressed for the day. She straightened her prayer cap and then smoothed down her apron with both hands before she headed down the stairs. Nervousness always made her mouth dry, so she licked her lips and then took a deep breath to steady herself before she opened the door. She stood in the doorway watching him as he pulled out a large box from the back of the buggy. He looked up and saw her. "Hello." "Hello. What have you got there?" He looked down at the box and then looked back up at her. It's food that they didn't move at the store. I thought you and Meg could use it. It's just vegetables and fruit. She laughed. Sounds like you stole them. No, never. He chuckled. They couldn't sell these things. He walked up the steps. Thank you. That was very kind. He said, where shall I put it? In the kitchen. He followed her inside and placed the box on the round kitchen table. Where's Eva? She was so tired. I just put her down for a nap. I'm sorry I missed her. He rubbed his hands together. Show me this window. Yeah, it's just through here. As she walked through to the living room, she felt she should say something about the dinner. Sorry about what went on last night at dinner. I know you saw through the matchmaking job Sue was doing. He chuckled. Don't give it another thought. It's not the first time it's happened to me. In fact, it happens a lot. That showed her he was a fussy man if he'd been in similar situations, and he'd never found a woman who suited. It's never happened to me before, and I felt awful, and I also felt awful for you. He laughed. Don't give it another thought. I'll try. I'll do my best to put it out of my mind. After he looked at the window, he took a look around. Okay. What else needs fixing? This is it, really. Just the window. I've managed to acquire a few skills myself since my husband died. I'm sure there's no need for that. People in the community would help you out, surely. I don't need help and I enjoy doing things. Malachi is always offering to help, but he's so busy with all that he's got going on. David knelt down and took a closer look at the window frame. He tapped it in a couple of places. I can see light coming through here. The air whistles through. I'll need to replace half of the frame. It'll be easier to replace it all than to do a repair. She hoped he knew what he was doing. All of it. Yeah. I want everything to fit snug and square, airtight, and that's the only way. Do you know how much that will be? I'll find out. I'll be back. He headed to his buggy and then came back inside with a measuring tape, along with pen and paper. I'll jot down the measurements. It won't be too much. Thank you. Much appreciated. Can you make me a cup of coffee? I'd love to do that. Coming up. She zipped into the kitchen and put the water on to boil. While she set the cups on a tray and cut some cake, she thought about Joseph. Another man was fixing the house that they'd bought. It gave her an odd feeling. She took the coffee out to the living room, and David looked up from writing things down on his notepad. Thank you for the coffee. I'll drink it and then go to the lumberyard. She set the coffee tray down on the low table. I'll get you some money. Do you know how much it'll be, roughly? I'll fix it. Don't worry about it. I'm sure the lumberyard will have some offcuts they're throwing away. It's only a small window. She wasn't sure if she believed all of that. Do you have tools? I have all I need in Hank's buggy. Are you sure you don't have any other odd jobs that I could do at the same time? Nothing really. Sue said you did. That's just Sue. There's nothing urgent. Nothing that needs doing right away. Have a seat. Once he sat down, she knew this was her chance to get to know him. She sat down next to him. He picked up his coffee and took a sip. How long has your husband been gone? That was the worst subject he could have spoken about. She picked up the plate of cake and offered him a piece. When he had taken a slice, she carefully put the plate down on the table. He died a couple of months after we found out I was pregnant. He was so looking forward to being a father, and then he died. He didn't even get to hold her in his arms. Pins and needles prickled her whole body and she tried to stop the tears. She looked away from him. That must be hard. Yeah, it has been, but life's like that sometimes. We deal with it the best we can because we have no other choice. Well said. That's very true. There's not much we can do about anything. We're not in charge of much in the whole scheme of things. We're in charge of ourselves and the decisions we make. Fighting to take control of her emotions, she smiled and looked back at him. That's often the biggest battle. Millie wondered if he had something in his life he wasn't in control of, yet she was too polite to ask. Do you have many brothers and sisters? One younger brother and two older ones. No sister. I was closest with Abraham, my oldest brother. And where's he now? He lives far away. What about yourself and your siblings? There's only me and Sue. That's a very small family. It is. She swallowed a mouthful of coffee. Would Eva be an only child? Millie would be dreadfully lonely without Sue, and she wanted Eva to have someone who was family when the years ticked on and Millie went home to be with God. In the meantime, it would be a lonely life if it was only ever her and Eva. Unless she married again to a nice man like David. Did he find her as attractive and interesting as she found him? He drained the last of his coffee. I should make a start or you'll have a hole there instead of a window tonight. That would be dreadful. She giggled, picturing Meg's disapproving face if that were to happen. He stood up and she leaned forward, ready to stand. He put a hand up. You stay there. I'll see myself out. I shouldn't be too long. Okay. He was gone about an hour and came back with pieces of wood that he insisted were offcuts that the lumberyard didn't need. Strange though that they were all exactly the right sizes. He pulled out tools from Hank's buggy and set about framing up the window. She learned that her old window frame had developed wood rot. Chapter 9. Humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 6. When Millie was in the middle of peeling vegetables for dinner in the kitchen, David walked in. Come take a look and see what you think. You're not finished already, are you? He chuckled. Come and see for yourself. She put the peeling knife down on the table, wiped her hands on a hand towel, and headed into the living room to see him standing next to the window. I worked with a glazier for about a year, so I learned a lot from him. It's perfect. It looked as good as new. It will be after it's painted. You don't have any paint lying around, do you? Yeah, actually. There are a few cans of paint in the barn, if any of it is still good. With a lick of paint, it'll be all set. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. I'll show you where that paint is. Do you want to do that today? Do you have the time? Yeah. I don't like to leave a job half done. She took him out to the barn, trying to stop thinking about Joseph. He'd painted the house soon after they bought it, 4 years ago. After they found a can of white paint, David opened the lid. Seems all right still. It'll be okay once it's well stirred. Millie went back to preparing the meal, and David busied himself with the painting, doing the outside first. She then sat out in the living room and watched him finish the last of the indoor strokes. There. As good as new, he said. It is new, not just as good as. Meg will be so impressed. There'll be no cold wind on her tonight. Thank you. You're welcome. I'll clean up here and then I'll be on my way. Can you at least stay for dinner? Hank and Janet have invited people for dinner. I think it would be rude if I didn't stay there. Oh. I suppose you're right. Would you like to do something with me tomorrow? Like what? She looked at him, trying not to appear too eager. Show me around the area. I haven't had an official guided tour. I'd like that. He gave her a big smile. Me too. Eva cried out just then. Someone's awake. She slept a long time. I know. She'll stay up until about 9 tonight. She's a good sleeper. She sleeps all through the night now. He looked down at his paintbrush. Can you point me to the outside tap? Sure. Once she steered him in the right direction, they made a time for tomorrow and then said their goodbyes. When Meg got home, Millie was eager to show her the new window. As soon as she walked in the door, Meg sniffed the air. I can smell paint. That's because we have a wonderful new window, and David painted it too. Come and have a look. Meg walked over, stood still and stared at the window. He did a good job, but I don't know about the paint fumes around Eva. I can't smell anything. I can. Your nose is just used to the smell by now. Help me move her into the kitchen. Together they moved the playpen into the kitchen, which was where Eva normally stayed when Millie was working around the house. "You managed to cook dinner with the visitor under your feet?" "He worked on the window while I cooked. He wasn't under my feet at all, and as soon as he was finished he left. Oh, and he asked me to show him around tomorrow." "What for?" To show him around the town." Slowly Meg nodded. "I see. It's like that. And Eva?" "Yeah, I'll take her too." The next morning when David arrived, he walked toward Millie and Meg, who were standing outside the house. Millie had Eva in her arms. "There's no sense in taking the baby with you," Meg said. "She'll be okay here." "Oh, are you sure?" Millie would have felt better taking Eva with her, but it might have been a challenge for her when nap time came. "Yeah, I'm sure," Meg said as she took Eva out of her mother's arms. "We'll have a good time together." "Okay. Thank you." Millie turned to David. "Looks like it's just me." "All right. Are you ready to go?" "I am." She turned around to face Meg. "I'm not sure what time I'll be home." "Take your time. There's no need to rush." When Millie climbed into the buggy next to David, she felt panicked and considered changing her mind. She took a deep breath and told herself she had to get on with the rest of her life. And that meant taking steps toward a new relationship. She knew herself well enough to know she was the kind of woman who liked to be married. Although she could survive alone, she didn't want to. He glanced over at her. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I'm just not used to leaving Eva." He slowly nodded. "I understand. I don't know what it's like to be a father or a parent, but it can't be easy when you are so used to being with her." She wondered if he was talking about her baby, or whether he was missing someone of his own. When they got to the road, he turned to the right and then said, "I hope you don't mind, but I combined our day with some work." "What kind of work?" "Look in the back." She turned and raised herself a little. In the back were boxes of groceries. "Oh. Where are we taking them?" "Home deliveries. This is something Hank has started recently." "Interesting. That's something I might be able to use. When I was a little girl, there was a truck that came around selling vegetables and fruit. There weren't so many stores around back then. The big stores here don't deliver, so Hank was looking for ways to get more business. This should help." "Maybe." He handed her a list of names and addresses. "Can you be my guide?" "Sure." She looked at the page. "Yeah. I know where all of these places are." He chuckled. "Good. Hank said he put them in order for me. The first one's not too far." "When is Meg going home?" "I don't know. She keeps talking about it. I expect she'll make a sudden decision and then she'll be gone." "Already?" "She's been here for months. Since before Eva was born. Didn't I tell you that?" "Yeah, that's right, you did. And you didn't notice she wasn't in Black Creek because you weren't there? Is that right?" He chuckled and looked over at her. "That's correct." She didn't feel like asking exactly where he'd been living since he hadn't offered the information. The last thing she wanted was to sound like she was interrogating him. Chapter 10. Deceit is in the heart of them that imagine evil, but to the counselors of peace is joy. Proverbs chapter 12 verse 20. When the deliveries were finished 2 hours later, David said, "I'm sorry. I should have realized how long this would take. I've eaten into our time together." "That's okay. We've had the time together anyway, and I've gotten to know you a little better. And you've seen some of the area. Do you have a bit more time?" "Sure. It's okay if I get back in the mid-afternoon." "That's good. You can show me your favorite places." She took him past the old mill by the creek, to a large grassy area where her mother used to take her and Sue to picnic when they were young. Then they traveled to one of the historic covered bridges, the oldest one in the area. The bridges were always a hit with visitors. She had always loved them, and David praised its combination of beauty and strength. "Are you getting hungry?" he asked as they drove on. "I am. There's a diner not far from here. Just turn to the left up there. Their food is pretty good." As they drove, they talked about nothing in particular, and Millie found herself relaxing and enjoying his company. They sat in a booth at the diner and studied the menu. It was an odd feeling to be away from Eva for this long, but it was the best way for her to get to know David. "What have you decided to eat?" "I think I'll just have a small burger." "I'm going to have a large one with fries." "Are you that hungry?" "I always am." "Aren't the Fishers feeding you enough?" He laughed. "I've always been that way. I love food. All kinds and lots of it." "Me too. But not necessarily the lots of it part." After they'd given their order to the waitress, Millie decided to ask some probing questions. "Tell me about your mother." She wanted to know why and how he could stay away from his family for so long. To her, it wasn't a good sign that he'd make a good husband if he wasn't close with his family. "Mom is quiet and floats along with things. She's very meek and mild until you do something she doesn't like." Millie laughed, trying to picture such a woman. "Oh, and what happens then?" "Whoever has crossed her will never do it again." "Ah, it sounds like she's really a tough woman." "She can be." "Meg said your older brother started a community up north somewhere?" "That's right. That's Abraham. I went with him for a while. I was there for about 6 months until I came back. That was quite a few years ago now. There's about 10 families there now, and Abraham's moved on to another place." "It sounds like the boys in your family like to move around." "Not really. I've traveled in the past, but that doesn't mean I'll always do it. Not if there was something keeping me in one place, or someone, I should say." He grinned, showing his dimples, and she knew what he meant, but she wasn't ready to make any promises or commitments just yet. And certainly not to someone she'd only just met. The other thing was that he wasn't forthcoming about himself. The waitress brought their sodas to the table, and then, before another word was said between them, their meals arrived. "Ah, this does look good. How am I going to get my mouth around that burger?" Millie looked at it and laughed. "You did order the triple stack?" He shook his head. "I did. I'll just have to do my best." She pushed some paper napkins closer to him. "You might need those." "Thank you." After he ate a mouthful, rolling his eyes in enjoyment, he put the sandwich down and asked, "Do you think you'd ever marry again?" The question took her by complete surprise. More so, the timing of him asking it. She'd talked about that with Sue, and even had a couple of conversations about it with her mother-in-law, who'd become more like a friend. She stopped chewing and looked up at him in shock. She swallowed so she could answer, and then the food got caught in her throat. The only thing she could do was either spit it out or make an effort to swallow. Millie grabbed the glass of soda, took a big gulp, and washed the food down. It hurt, so she held her throat as she felt the half-chewed food work its way down. "Are you okay?" She nodded. Him. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked." "Don't be sorry. I'm not making any plans. I've come to think I would like to marry again one day." "Anyone in mind?" he asked. "Well, I can't reveal all my secrets." "And what about you? Why have you never married?" He moved uncomfortably in his seat. "I've been close a couple of times, but it's never quite worked out." "Why not?" "Various reasons. It's too complicated to explain them." He wasn't giving much away, so she was glad she hadn't told him too much either. Still, she probed a little further. "Do you want to get married? I know some men and even some women are content to remain single." "There's nothing I'd like more than to marry. It's on my mind quite a bit. I'm not getting any younger. And I don't want to have children when I'm too old. My parents were quite old when they had me, and I want to be an energetic father." "I understand. You don't want to be the age of a grandfather when you have children." "That's right, exactly." Slowly she nodded. "I can understand that." She looked back down at her food and broke off a tiny piece and popped it into her mouth. The near choking incident had turned her off eating. "Were the women that you were close to marrying from your community?" "They were. But I'd consider someone in a different community. I'd move anywhere for love." It was hard to believe that a man such as he was still single. Chapter 11. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Matthew chapter 5 verse 9. When their time together was over, he pulled the buggy up at the house. Millie turned to David. Do you have to go right away, or can you come in? No, yeah. He laughed. That's one of those questions that's backwards however I answer it. Sure, I can come in. Good. She waited with a smile as he secured the horse. They walked into the house to see Eva on the rug at Meg's feet, while Meg sat working on the squares she was knitting for a blanket. She jumped up when she saw them. Can I get you two anything? No, we're fine. Can we get you something? Millie asked. Meg chuckled. I wouldn't mind a cup of coffee if you're making one. Sure. I'll help you with that, David said. When they got to the kitchen, Millie said, You can sit down. It doesn't require two to make coffee. Okay. I'll watch you do it. She smiled as she filled the kettle with water. Will you tell me if there's anything else that needs fixing in the house? It's no trouble for me. She giggled. I will. She lit the stove and placed the kettle down on the flames. Do you have enough firewood? Plenty. Who chops it for you? I do it, or Meg does. Meg's quite good at it. Is there anyone living in her house while she's here? She sat down with him. I never asked. That's a good question. It's quite a large place, isn't it? It is. You've been to Black Creek, have you? Only once. Right after Joseph and I married. I don't remember seeing you there. I wasn't there at the time. I was away. She didn't know if she liked the sound of all the traveling he had done. He could be a man who would find it hard to settle down, even though he said otherwise. He might thrive on the excitement of visiting different places. She didn't want to marry a man who was going to leave her, or get close to marrying and decide she wasn't the right one. From what little he had said, that was what she gathered he'd done in the past. He leaned in close to her. It's nice that Meg came here. Has it been good for you having her here? I don't know what I would have done without her. I'm grateful she came. She'll have to go sooner or later, though. And what will you do then? She smiled at him. I'm a grown woman. I'm quite capable of looking after myself. Slowly he nodded. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend. You didn't. I'll be all right. We'll be all right, she corrected herself, shaking her head. No doubt you will. You seem to be a strong woman. I like to think so. When the coffee was ready, she put it and a plate of cookies on a tray with 3 cups, and he carried it out to the living room. They put the things on the low table in front of Meg, and David sat down on the floor with the baby. Then he looked up at Millie. Do you mind me playing with her? Of course I don't. He sat and made faces at Eva until she giggled. Meg and Millie laughed too. I've never heard her laugh so hard, Meg said. Me either. Meg squealed. Look. She's crawling. Millie took a closer look. Eva was definitely moving on her stomach, but not exactly crawling. David looked up at them. Is this the first time she's done that? It is. The baby kept pulling her way toward him. It's a wonder, Meg said. She's growing up so fast. She is, Millie agreed. There were few men who would get down and play with a baby like he did. Millie saw that David had the potential to be a wonderful father. You certainly like children. Or is it only babies you like? Meg asked. He chuckled. I like children of all ages. Children don't think before they speak, they just say what's on their minds. I find it refreshing and adorable. Sometimes it's not good that they say the first thing that comes into their head. They have to be taught to be mindful of the feelings of others, Meg said in a typical grandmother response. They are saying what they think as they see it through their eyes. Meg shook her head. Where do you get these ideas from? Children have to be trained how to behave properly. Once you have your own, you'll see what I mean. You don't want them to embarrass you by saying silly things, do you? David chuckled. I think that's part of life and the journey of growing up. To try to learn what is right by the example of their parents. To be corrected by their parents the same way as one would correct a dog or a cat. Millie burst out laughing, knowing that Meg wouldn't like what he had just said. David was saying all the wrong things. Meg opened her mouth in shock and then looked down her nose at Millie, who was still laughing. David, comparing people to animals is not a good idea. God doesn't give the animals what he gives us. We're starting to get into too deep a conversation here, I think, Millie said. Come and drink your coffee, David, it's getting cold. He left off playing with the baby, got up and sat on a chair opposite the couch where the two women sat. I didn't mean to upset you, Meg. I'm just telling you how things should be. You should always learn from your elders. Quite right. He leaned forward and picked up his coffee mug. The atmosphere in the room had turned frosty. Thank you for this, Millie, David said. You're welcome. He leaned over and took a cookie. Did you bake these, Meg? Meg simply nodded. When he finished his first bite, he said, It's really good. Meg shook her head. They're just simple coconut and vanilla cookies. Wonderful, he said before he took a large mouthful of coffee. Millie sat there not knowing what to say, so she didn't say anything at all. She noticed David was drinking his coffee as fast as he could, and she couldn't blame him. Thank you for your company today, Millie. You're welcome. I enjoyed it very much. He placed his mug back down on the table. I should go. I'll walk you out. Millie rose from the couch just as Meg said a curt goodbye. As Millie walked him to the buggy, she didn't know whether to apologize for Meg's attitude or not. She certainly was acting weird, but at the same time, Millie didn't want to be talking behind Meg's back, especially when her mother-in-law had been so good to her. Thank you again for today. I had a lovely time. That's all I wanted. To see a smile on your face. He climbed up into his buggy. I'll see you again. The words had slipped out. She should have just said goodbye. What she had said sounded too anxious to her. Soon, I hope. He gave her a big smile and then moved his buggy forward. She could certainly get used to his company. When he was well and truly gone, she went back inside, sat down with Meg and snatched up a cookie from the plate. What upset you just now? What do you mean? You seemed to be hostile with him toward the end. She nodded. I didn't mean to. She looked thoughtfully at Eva, seeming to hunt for words. I'm a little worried that you two are getting too close too quickly. Meg folded her arms across her chest. All I wanted was for you to have a break from looking after Eva, and to think about yourself for a while. I didn't want to push you into making mistakes with the first man that catches your eye. You're not pushing me. I enjoy his company and you know his family, and that makes me feel better about him. He's not a stranger. Meg nodded. His family are well thought of, and that goes for all the sons. I'm pleased to hear it. When will you see him again? He hadn't made any plans to see her again, and she admitted to herself that bothered her a little. Not that she'd been overtly encouraging. Nothing's been arranged. Have you thought what would happen if you marry him? Where will you live? I haven't thought about anything that complicated. I've only just met him. I can tell you he's thinking about it. He's very keen on you. I can see it in his eyes. Millie reached forward, took another cookie and nibbled thoughtfully on it. Is Meg feeling jealous? Chapter 12. Being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. Philippians chapter 1 verse 6. Millie didn't have to wait long to see David again. The next morning, Millie was feeding Eva cereal when she heard a buggy. Who's that? She asked Meg, who was doing dishes. Meg moved the curtain aside. It's David. Oh, he didn't say he was coming by this morning. Meg dried her hands. You go see him. I'll finish feeding Eva. Thank you. She opened the front door just as David was jumping down from the buggy. I have something here, he said. Millie walked over. What do you have? He walked around to the back of the buggy and she joined him and looked in to see a small wooden rocking horse. She gasped. It's beautiful. I always wanted one of these when I was a kid. Once he'd pulled it out and set it on the ground, he said, It's for Eva. No. Yeah, it is. When I was at the lumberyard, I saw this. I went back and asked about it. He tipped his hat back slightly and placed his hands on his hips. Turns out someone had made it and didn't want it. They said I could have it. No. I can't believe that. He chuckled. They can't have been giving it away. She ran her fingers over the carved head and mane. Surely not. She eyed him skeptically. It must be worth a lot of money. He chuckled. I know. I can't understand some people. I said I'd have it if they were giving it away. Anyway, it's Eva's now. Are you sure? Of course. I'll bring it into the house. How old do you think she'll be before she can use this? He asked. I'd say around 2. We'll have to see. I'm so grateful for you fixing the window too. It was my pleasure. It doesn't take much for me to do things, so let me know if there's anything else. You said that before and I will keep it in mind. I mean it. She nodded. But she knew she couldn't take advantage of him. When they walked into the house, she asked, Would you mind carrying it upstairs to Eva's bedroom? She's asleep? No, she's having breakfast with Meg in the kitchen. Sure. You lead the way. She walked up the stairs and he followed her carrying the rocking horse. She opened the door and asked him to put it by the window. As she watched him place it down on the floor, she said, I still can't believe that someone was giving that rocking horse away. Me either. It's amazing what some people want to get rid of. What do they say, one person's trash is another's treasure? I haven't heard that. He shrugged his shoulders. That's what they say. Oh, before I forget, would you and Meg come for dinner tonight at Hank and Karen's? That would be lovely. Good. What time would you want us there? Any time. 6 o'clock? She nodded. Perfect. He flashed her a big smile, and Millie nearly melted when she looked into his warm dark hazel eyes. I'll see you then. Can you stay for coffee or perhaps some breakfast? That would have been good, but I have to help Hank today. I'll walk you out. When they were at the bottom of the stairs, he whispered, I'll say a quick hello to Meg. Yeah, of course. He ducked his head into the kitchen and said hello to Meg and the baby. We've been invited to Hank and Karen's for dinner, Millie told Meg. For when? Tonight. Lovely. Can you stay for a cup of coffee? Meg asked. No. I'm spending a full day at the store today, so Karen can stay home to get the dinner ready. He turned to Millie and smiled. I'll see you tonight then. Yeah. Millie walked him outside, and then she leaned on the porch railing watching him stride to his buggy. He moved like someone with purpose, like someone who knew where he was going. When his buggy was halfway down the driveway, Meg walked out and stood beside her holding Eva. That's odd. Millie turned around to face her. What's that? It's a bit late notice to invite us for dinner for tonight. Millie laughed. I don't think so. Or, maybe Karen didn't invite us for dinner. He must have asked them if he could ask us. I think he did, and that's a good thing, isn't it? Meg stared at Millie. He seems to make you happy. If he does, he has my approval. Millie giggled. I'm glad to hear it. First I thought you liked him, and then I thought you didn't like him. I just want you to make the right choice, that's all. Thank you. I'm glad I have someone watching out for me. Meg smiled at her. What should we make to take with us tonight? Millie asked. I'll make a dessert. You can't ever have too many desserts. I'll make a batch of whoopie pies. I love them. Most people do. Eva cried and Millie took her from Meg. She might need a nap. Leave her be for a while when she wakes this time. You'll spoil her if you're there as soon as she wakes. You never let her cry. Meg and she agreed on most things, but Millie didn't want her baby to be distressed and she hated it when Eva cried. Her heart ached when her baby was upset. When Millie didn't say anything, Meg added, Do what you want then. You will anyway when I'm gone. I hope that's not too far away. Millie giggled when she realized what she had said. I didn't mean that. I meant that I hope you don't leave too soon. Meg smiled. I'll do you a trade. You do the washing today and I'll do the cooking. Gladly accepted. As she walked up the stairs with Eva in her arms, she said, You're growing up so fast. Please don't grow up too fast and leave me. I think someone needs a diaper change. She whispered to Eva, Did you hear David? He was here, and now we're going to see him again tonight for dinner. Eva reached out and grasped one of the strings of Millie's prayer cap, and like most things, it went into her mouth. Millie pulled it away from her and tossed both strings over her shoulder. You mustn't do that. While Millie was changing the diaper, she noticed the rocking horse by the window. She'd have to tell her mother-in-law about it before Meg saw it for herself. After she put Eva down for her nap, she summoned the courage and walked to the kitchen to tell Meg the news. David arrived with a special surprise for Eva. What is it? A year's supply of milk. Millie giggled. It was nothing from the grocery store. It's a wooden rocking horse. It's so handsome and it looks as though it's all hand-carved. That sounds like it would have cost a lot. I don't know. She wasn't going to tell Meg that he'd said someone was throwing it out. She'll have a lot of fun with it. She's far too young for anything like that. It'll still be there when she's older. She'll grow into it. Seems he brings a gift every time he comes here. Millie laughed. He's only brought 2 things and he's been here 3 times. She knew that made it obvious she liked him since she'd been keeping count. I'll put the washing on. Millie left the room quickly. Chapter 13. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Genesis chapter 8 verse 20. At 6 o'clock that evening, Millie and Meg walked into the Fisher's house. Meg carried a tray of whoopie pies, and Millie had her hands full with Eva. Karen rushed to take the tray out of Meg's hands. They were directed to the living room, and sat in front of the fire. When Karen returned from the kitchen, she asked to hold Eva. Then she sat down next to Hank. Meg looked over at Hank. How is the store doing? We're doing okay. We started home deliveries. I know. Millie told me that on the way over. And David had another good idea, Hank told them. What was that? Meg asked. We're a small store and we can't compete with the big stores, so in addition to doing home deliveries, we're thinking of setting up a wagon going house to house. We'll pick a day of the week, probably Monday, and we'll sell things off the wagon. Just something we were thinking about, Karen said as she played peekaboo with Eva. It was Millie who gave me the idea. She said she remembered when she was a girl there was a truck that used to come by with fruits and vegetables. We're going back in time and concentrating on things the supermarkets aren't. I like that, Millie said. It was just an idea that David had. He's full of ideas. Meg said, in the early days when Joseph had the store it did really well until the big supermarkets came to town. It's hard to compete with them. That's why we have to sell things that they don't have and do things they don't do, David said. We? Meg asked. David chuckled. I haven't bought into the store or anything. It's nothing like that. I just like to throw myself into things while I'm staying here. And how long do you expect to be here? Meg asked. Eva let out a high-pitched squeal. I think she's hungry, Karen said. She shouldn't be too hungry. She's only just eaten. Maybe she's teething. Our first one had a terrible time when he was teething, Karen said. How many do you have? Meg asked. 5 all boys. They're all grown now. Meg has 5 boys too, Millie said. Or had, I suppose I should say, since Joseph has gone. Except now I have taken Millie under my wing as my daughter. Not just my daughter-in-law anymore. I've appointed myself as her mother. Karen laughed. I feel the same about mine. Now, are we all ready to sit down for dinner? After the dinner, when Meg and Millie were driving home, Meg was clearly bothered by something. Something just wasn't right with him. What do you mean? Millie asked. Somebody's hiding something. Deciding what? I said hiding, covering up something. Hank and Karen are hiding something to do with David. That's what it sounded like to me. Millie took her eyes off the dark road lit only by the buggy lights and looked over at Meg. Was she being overly suspicious? What do you think it is? I think that there's some different reason why he's here. No one said the reason and he hasn't said so. Has he told you why he's here? She thought about it for a moment. Not really. Do you think he's had some kind of trouble in your community back home? That crossed my mind. But I won't know that until I go back or until this postal strike ends. Paula would know. She knows everything. Can you call her? She doesn't have a phone in her barn. There's a shanty 2 doors from her home. She can call out but no one can call her. Maybe it's nothing, Millie said. It seems you thought that too, though? Meg asked. I don't know. I did notice that either Hank or Karen changed the subject a few times when you asked David questions. I felt something funny, like Hank and Karen were on guard the whole time, so they didn't say something wrong. I'm pretty sure I'm not wrong about this, Millie. It can't be anything too bad, can it? I don't know. Something's going on, and I'll get to the bottom of it. As much as Millie wanted to believe Meg wasn't right, a small part of her knew the Fishers were acting strange. No one seemed to have a good reason why David was there. All she knew for certain was that he'd met the Fishers at a funeral. That night all Millie could think about was David and what he could be hiding. Perhaps he was hiding something from the whole community, but then again, given their behavior, Hank and Karen were in on it. Possibly the whole thing was in Meg's and her minds, and nothing at all was going on. Either way, she could not give away her heart too soon. With David she felt barriers, but with Joseph there had been nothing like that at all. The two men were so different. David was fun-loving, whereas Joseph would never have joked or exaggerated about anything. He'd never say things were free or unwanted the way that David had, but did that mean David was any less devoted to God or any less reliable? Chapter 14. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength, they shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. And they shall walk and not faint. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 31. Despite a distinct lack of sleep, Millie was up early even before Meg and Eva. She headed to the kitchen and made herself some coffee and took it out to the living room. She flung open the heavy curtains that blocked out every trace of light, sat down on the couch and looked out at the sun rising over the fields. It was a rare moment that she was alone, and with the morning came a newfound optimism about David. She sipped her coffee, enjoying the ever-changing sky as the glowing sun peeped its head over the horizon and stretched forth its rays over God's earth. When Millie heard footsteps, she looked around to see Meg walking down the stairs, her long gray hair in a play over one shoulder as she tied up the cord of her dressing gown. She stopped still at the bottom of the stairs, staring at Millie. Why are you up so early? I don't know. I just woke up early. Have you made breakfast? No. I'm just sitting here thinking. Like some company? Sure. Sit down and I'll get you some coffee. They both started their days with a mug of strong coffee. It was one thing they had in common. You stay. I'll get it. Millie sat there looking out the window, knowing last night's dinner was still on Meg's mind too. When Meg sat next to her with a steaming mug of coffee, Millie said, I've given it a lot of thought and I don't think anyone's hiding anything. You've been thinking about David all night, have you? Yeah, well, not in that way. I think you were. He'll be your second husband. I think you'll marry him. Just don't forget your family. Me and the boys are your family. Don't forget us. Of course. I could never forget you. You're my family and you're my mother, remember? Meg chortled. I hope that's true, not that I meant I'm replacing your own mother. I'll visit as much as I can if you'll allow me. I hope you do. You'll be Eva's grandmother forever. Meg gave a long drawn-out sigh. I've been thinking that I should really get back home. I'm only in the way here with you and David getting to know each other better. I've outstayed my usefulness around here. You're welcome to stay here as long as you want. You don't have to be useful. Stay here and I'll look after you for a change. Meg chuckled. I don't need anyone to look after me. I'm not that old yet. Are you homesick? Especially now that you've lost contact with Black Creek through Paula's letters? I think so, and you're right, even more so now that I'm not getting news from home. Then you should go back. Will you visit? They'd had this conversation more than once. When Eva is a little older, I will. I think it's too far away to take her when she's so young. Very well. Will you help me book the ticket? That was something new. That meant Meg was serious about going home. Of course I will. I'll leave soon then, the day after tomorrow. If that's what you want. Are you sure? Now that it was really going to happen, the idea of being completely alone with her baby in the large house scared Millie a little. I'd rather be in both places. I have missed my other grandchildren, but when I get back I'll miss Eva. I knew this would happen when Joseph met you. He seemed quite happy to stay in this community. Millie nodded, remembering happier days. He was content here. You always feel more protective of the youngest, and Joseph was my youngest. Millie giggled. I don't think Joseph needed protecting. He was well over 6 feet and built like a barn. I mean, he wasn't fat, but he wasn't skinny. He was solidly built, I know, but I don't mean protect like that. I meant to look after him, make sure he feels okay. I'm sure you felt exactly the same about all your other children. He was probably just the last one you felt like that about. Meg slowly nodded. That could be true. More than likely. Meg pushed her long play behind her shoulder. I think you and David will make a good pair. It was still odd for Millie to think she'd be a match with anyone other than Joseph, and it was weirder still to hear such a thought coming from Joseph's mother. Everyone will miss you when you're gone. I know. I've made such good friends here. I would suggest that you move here, but then you've got all of your family in Black Creek. I'll just have to do a lot of traveling back here to see you both. Yeah, until Eva is old enough, and then we'll do the traveling to see you and visit with her cousins and aunts and uncles. Meg reached over and tapped Millie on her hand. Thank you, Millie, for having me here. The time has come for me to go. Meg, could you just stay for one more week? I just want to get used to the idea of you going. Okay. I'll stay for one more week. Meg's eyes crinkled at the corners. Chapter 15. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. All ye that hope in the Lord. Psalms 31-24. On Monday, Millie hadn't seen David for one whole day, and she wanted to talk with him so badly she made up an excuse to go to the store. She suddenly had the urge to make coconut iced squares. Her mother had named them that. They were pink and white confectionery fashioned into squares. They were mainly sugar and coconut pressed together with oil. The bottom layer was pink and the top was white. Since Millie didn't have any desiccated coconut in the pantry, it was as good an excuse as any. Meg insisted she leave the baby with her, saying that Millie should take advantage of all the help she could since she'd soon be going home. Millie agreed and made her way to the store. As Millie's horse trotted along the street, nervousness ate away at Millie's stomach at the thought of seeing David. She only hoped he was working at the store today. She parked the buggy across the road from the store and hurried over. When she was halfway across, she spotted David just inside the door helping a customer. He saw her and waved. When she was inside the store, she saw he was the only one there, and was busy putting a customer's order through the register. As soon as the customer was gone, he walked over to her just as she was putting coconut into her basket. Good Mary. Hello. I just forgot a few things when I was here last. I was just thinking about you. You were? He chuckled. I have to confess I spend most of my time thinking about you lately. She was pleased to hear it. Would you be free to come for dinner tonight? Tonight? Yeah. I'd love that. Okay. She had no idea she was going to ask him. It certainly hadn't been planned. Can you be there at around 6? Sure. I can't wait. He glanced over his shoulder and then looked back at Millie. I have to go, sorry. I have to serve someone. She nodded. Go. She grabbed a few other items and then took them up to the counter just as he was handing the other customer their change. His eyes fixed on her once the other person was gone. Millie, you've got everything now? I hope so. He rang up her goods. That'll be 0. She frowned at him. David, you can't do that. 0. I have to pay. I'll put the money in. No. I've got it right here. He laughed and walked to the other side of the counter and picked up her goods that he'd placed in a bag. Put your money away. I'll walk you out. She put her money back in her purse. Thank you, but that makes me feel bad. It's a small gift. A minor token of appreciation. He put his hand on her elbow as they crossed the road. I'm looking forward to seeing you tonight. Me too. He opened the buggy door for her and then put her items in the back. Can I bring something tonight? No, nothing. Just yourself. I'm surprised Meg would want me there after last time. I sensed a little something, like she was untrusting of me. She's okay. She's just got a certain way of thinking and doing things, and behaving. He smiled and nodded. See you tonight. She moved her horse forward. When she was a little way up the road, she looked in her rear-view mirror and saw him outside the entrance of the store staring after her. When she got home, she wondered how Meg would react to the news that they had a dinner guest coming. Guess what? Meg looked up from feeding the baby in her high chair. What's that? I invited David for dinner tonight. That's good. I thought you two might have some catching up to do. Very good. We just saw him recently. No matter. I like having people join us for dinner. I always had people stopping by around dinner time at home. I'd always make much more than I could ever eat. I never stopped cooking for a large number of people and it never went to waste. What do you think we should cook? I'll do the cooking if you'd like. Really? Millie was a little surprised Meg had offered to cook. I love your cooking. Would you like me to make myself scarce and not stay for dinner? I could have dinner somewhere else, you know. No. Millie laughed. That would be awkward in so many ways. If you're going to cook, I'll clean the house. What about that coconut treat you had your heart set on making? She saw the smile hinting around Meg's lips and knew Meg had known all along what she'd been up to. I'll make that another day. Millie waited for David to come, and at a few minutes before 6 he was there. She walked out of the house to meet him. Meg has cooked the dinner for tonight. She's an amazing cook. He looped the reins over the post. She's known for being a cook back home. Many of the young women go to her for her recipes, and ask her to show them a thing or two about cooking. How do you know that? He chuckled. I'm not really sure. I must have heard it somewhere along the way. As they walked toward the house, Millie said, I didn't know Meg's cooking was so famous. It is. Don't tell me Eva's asleep again? No. She's in the kitchen in the playpen. They walked into the kitchen and Meg swung around. Hello, David. Hi, Meg. I was just telling Millie that you're well known back home for your cooking. She laughed. I enjoy it. You're always good at something if you like what you're doing. He looked over at Eva in the corner of the room. He picked up a couple of her toys and leaned over and started playing with her. She giggled as he bounced 2 wooden toys around and made funny noises. Millie, if you want to put her in the high chair now, we can have dinner. Sure. Millie laughed when David made an exaggerated frown at having his playtime with Eva interrupted. He picked up the baby and carried her to the high chair. Soon they were gathered around the table. On one side of Millie was Eva and on the other was David. They bowed their heads in a silent prayer of thanks for the food. When they finished, the bowls of food were passed around. There were mashed potatoes, Dutch cabbage rolls, butter noodles, plenty of green vegetables, and as always, Meg had made sauerkraut. She served sauerkraut with nearly every meal. As David spooned food onto his plate, he said, This certainly looks delicious, Meg. The proof is in the eating. He took a mouthful, and after he swallowed, he turned to Millie. Can you cook as good as this? Of course she can, Meg said. Meg has taught me quite a bit while she's been here. The conversation flowed nicely over dinner as the topics were kept off ones where personal questions about David could arise. After dinner, Meg wasted no time in taking Eva upstairs to bed, leaving David and Millie to talk in the living room in front of the open fire. David leaned closer to her. It must be good to have a built-in babysitter here. I'm going to miss her greatly. She's going home in a few days. And how long are you staying here? He cleared his throat. Before I answer that, I was going to ask you something. Yeah. I've watched your face whenever I mention how I like to travel around and see different places. I know you didn't like the sound of it. She couldn't deny it, but she couldn't comment without revealing how much she truly felt for him. It's just that people usually like to settle in one place. I've never known someone like you who moves frequently. The thing is, I never had a reason to stay in one place until I met you. She stared into his eyes. Really? He nodded. I didn't know you were feeling that way. I thought you might have guessed. Normally I wouldn't speak my mind this fast, but since I'm due to be somewhere else soon, I need to tell you how I feel. At the risk of you rejecting me, I must tell you that I can see myself married to you and the three of us being a family. Really? He laughed. Is that all you can say? I can say other things, but this is just so very sudden. That's all right, Millie, you don't have to give me any answers right now. He'd put his feelings out there. Things between her and Joseph had happened naturally. But he wasn't Joseph, so she couldn't expect things to happen the same way. In this short time, I have developed feelings for you too. You have? She nodded. And a part of her wondered if Meg could hear what they said. It didn't matter, she had to tell him no matter who overheard. He reached for her hand and she gave it to him. The touch of his warm skin sent tingles throughout her body. 1,000,000 questions raced through her mind. When do you have to leave? Any day, but I'll be back. Where do you keep going? She saw him frown and she knew he didn't want to tell her. There are some people I have to visit. Can't you tell me? I've committed to do something for someone and that's all I can say right now. That's okay. I wouldn't want you to tell me anything unless you felt comfortable to do so. Well, it's not really me. It involves someone else. I understand. She smiled at him. She wasn't really understanding, but she couldn't force him to tell her. I'll miss you, he whispered. You will? Yeah. Me too, was all she could say. Is that true? Aha. He said, when I return I'd like to see more of you if I could. I'd like that. And that includes Eva. I know she's a part of you, and one day I'm hoping that I can be a part of both your lives. I'm just saying what's on my mind. These past few days meeting you reminded me of what I want out of life. I never thought I would find a woman like you. And it took me coming here to help out a friend to find you. She swallowed hard, taking it all in. Is Hank the man you're helping out? When I get back I'll tell you. I'm sorry I'm not free to tell you now. I know you must be wondering. I'll tell you everything in a couple of days. He laughed. Don't worry. It's nothing bad. I look forward to hearing what it is. I noticed some of the planks on the porch are raised. I'll hammer them down fully when I get back. I didn't want to bother you with anything so small. I'm quite capable of hammering in a nail. But why should you if I can do it for you? She knew her face was glowing because she could feel her body illuminated from within. It felt good to have someone to look after her again and treat her as though she was special. If she could fall in love again, it could make her feel whole again. When Meg came back downstairs from settling Eva, they chatted for a bit. David left soon after. His confession of strong feelings for her had Millie so happy she felt as though she was floating. She sat in the kitchen with Meg as Meg made her usual hot tea before bedtime. I enjoyed dinner. So did I, Millie agreed. You didn't have to wait up. I'm just off to bed as soon as I finish this hot tea. Can I make you one? Yeah, thank you. She knew Meg was looking at her face with the smile plastered all over it, but she didn't make a comment. Perhaps Meg had overheard, and that was why she didn't need to ask. Chapter 16. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Matthew chapter 11 verse 28. The next day after breakfast, Millie made Meg's travel arrangements. It was Friday when Meg went home to Black Creek. Even though David knew Meg would have been gone, there had been no sign of him. From what he'd said, he should have well and truly been back by the weekend, if a couple of days meant two. Perhaps when he said he'd be gone for a couple he'd meant a few, and in Millie's mind, a few could be much more than 3, sometimes even as long as a week. However, a whole week had gone by now, and there was still no sign of David. She did not want to make the first move and visit the store to see if he'd returned. Her idea was to sit back and wait to see what he'd do. If he had feelings for her like he'd said, he should have visited her as soon as he got back. Soon it was 2 weeks that had gone by. It brought back the old fear she'd had that he was hiding something. Meg had thought so too. Now it was Wednesday, and for the whole of Monday and Tuesday Millie had been trapped inside the house as it poured with heavy rain, barely ceasing. It had been reported there was to be a lengthy stretch of rainfall, and the weather reports hadn't been wrong. When Millie heard a buggy heading to her house, she hoped it was David. The rain had eased, and Millie desperately wanted company but daren't leave in case David stopped by when she was out. It was mid-afternoon, and she'd just put Eva down for a nap when she heard the buggy. She quickly tiptoed to Eva's window and saw the buggy halfway up the driveway, but it wasn't David driving it. It was Sylvia Miller, a woman Meg had become close with during the months Meg had stayed with Millie. Millie walked downstairs and pulled on her rain boots, then walked out to greet Sylvia, splashing through the puddles. "You're a brave woman coming out in the rain. It stopped raining when I left home. I have something to show you." "To show me?" "Yeah. I thought you'd be lonely since Meg has gone. It's certainly quiet, especially since I've been trapped inside the house for days with all this rain. I just can't wait to get out visiting again." Sylvia Miller didn't make a comment. She simply opened the back door of the buggy, and then flipped up the lid of a basket to reveal 6 small gray tabby kittens with fat tummies. "Ah, they're adorable. How old are they?" 6 weeks today and able to leave their mother. "Want one?" Sylvia smiled hopefully. "I'd love one." Sylvia's grin increased. "Choose any you'd like. What about 2 to keep each other company, or even 3? The old lady leaned forward staring at her. Millie giggled. "I couldn't possibly have 3. But I would love to have one." Sylvia pointed at the kittens in turn. "This one's the sleepy one. He sleeps most of the day. This one is the explorer, and this one can't get enough to eat. He pushes the others out of the way. He's already bigger than all the others. And this one's the shy one. And this one is well, there's nothing memorable about that one." "Then that's the one I'll have." Sylvia pulled a face. "Really?" "Yeah." "Is it a boy?" "Not really sure. That's the problem, you see. I thought my cat was a male, and then he had all these kittens. I thought I was feeding him too much when he got fat." Millie giggled at Sylvia, still calling the mother cat he. "It doesn't matter really. I'll get him or her neutered. Once it's yours, you can do what you like." "Could I have that one?" She pointed to the unmemorable one, with the white nose and the white tips on his ears. "Yeah, that's the plain one that doesn't have any particular personality." "I'm sure he does. He's probably just too intimidated by his siblings to truly shine." Sylvia laughed as she handed the kitten to Millie, cupped in her 2 hands. Millie took the kitten equally carefully and held him close to her. "Can I get you a cup of hot soup?" "That would suit me nicely." She closed the basket and then the buggy door. "Do you want to get the kittens inside out of the cold?" "It's warm in the buggy. They'll be fine." The kittens snuggled into Millie, not appearing too worried that he was changing ownership. Once they were inside, Millie found a box, placed a blanket into the bottom of it, and put it in the laundry room with the kitten already nestling into the blanket. She washed her hands and then walked into the kitchen to see Sylvia sitting down at the kitchen table. "I'll just heat that soup. I hope he doesn't miss his brothers and sisters." "You could take another?" Sylvia said. Millie laughed. "One will suit me nicely. I've missed having a cat. Joseph was allergic. I hope Eva's not." "Me too. She'll get used to it if she is." They sat together and ate the vegetable and bacon soup. It was a recipe that Meg had often made. "Thanks for thinking of me. I grew up around animals, but when Joseph died, the domestic animals became too much for me to handle. We had chickens, goats, and pigs. When he was gone, I had to cut down my work, especially since I was expecting Eva. And where is Eva now? Asleep. Sylvia had finished her soup and licked the back of the spoon. It can be hard after your husband dies, but you seem to be doing fine. Although you can't often tell what grief a person is going through. I'm fine. It helped having Meg here. There's always room in your heart to love again. She stared at Sylvia. Do you think so? I know it. I don't know if I could really feel anything as strong as what I felt for Joseph. It'll be different, but it'll still be love. Millie looked at Sylvia's empty bowl. Would you like more? Yeah, thank you, I would. Millie took the bowl, refilled it and placed it down in front of her guest before she sat back down. After Sylvia had slurped 2 large spoonfuls, she said, You need someone to look after you and young Eva. Maybe. There's always enough love to go around. There's always room in your heart to love someone else. You might be right about that. Thank you. I'm pleased you're looking for another man. I'm not. The last thing she wanted was for that rumor to get around. She had to set her straight. I'm not looking at all, but if one happens to show up. Let's just say I'm keeping an open mind. When Sylvia left, Millie looked in the basket at her new addition to the family. He was curled up asleep. She hoped his brothers and sisters all found good homes. The next day, a letter arrived from Meg. Millie sat down on the living room couch, excited to hear how Meg was settling back into her home. Firstly, she opened the envelope and counted up the pages. There were 4 of them, written on the back and the front. Millie had no idea how she'd write one back equally as long. Her gaze fell to the second paragraph on the first page when she noticed David's name. It appears that David and Joseph had more in common than what we knew. They were both betrothed to Fanny Graber. Chapter 17. Fear thou not, for I am with thee, be not dismayed, for I am thy God, I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. Isaiah chapter 41 verse 10. Millie's heart pounded, hardly believing what she read. She put the letter down, not wanting to know more. Then she knew she had to find out the truth of what was going on. It explained a few things. The weird behavior of the Fishers when David was mentioned, and the evasiveness David displayed when asked direct questions. With hesitation, she lifted the letter and continued. He was about to marry her, and then he left. Like a coward, he ended their relationship by letter. The letter fell from Millie's hands. It was true. That's what he was doing here. Escaping from Fanny. Fanny Graber was a name Millie knew all too well. When Millie met Joseph, he'd been set to marry Fanny Graber, a woman his mother wanted him to marry, but as soon as he and Millie had locked eyes on one another, there was no one else for either of them. She'd heard Fanny Graber was heartbroken, and that upset Millie, but not enough to give up the man she loved. A less selfish woman might have denied the yearnings of her heart, and encouraged Joseph to leave her and go through with the wedding to Fanny. When Joseph had the sudden stroke that killed him, Millie had worried that God had taken him from her as a punishment for her taking Joseph away from Fanny. Should she have told Joseph to stay with Fanny? She'd put her own happiness above Fanny's, and she couldn't do that to the poor woman for a second time. Millie put a hand over her stomach, feeling ill. As much as she liked David, she couldn't upset Fanny again, and that's exactly what she'd be doing if she continued a relationship with David. She could only imagine how upset Fanny would be right now. Being jilted by 2 men in one lifetime, and losing both of them to the same woman just wasn't fair. She'd never met Fanny, since Fanny hadn't been there that one time she'd visited Black Creek, but she could feel Fanny's pain as though it was her very own. That night Millie couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, wondering why David had never mentioned Fanny's name. It then occurred to her that he knew about Joseph and Fanny. Of course he would have known about Joseph breaking off his engagement years ago. He would have known she wouldn't approve, and that was why he had never told her about Fanny. She'd been tricked. The next morning, feeling weird and having a headache from lack of sleep, Millie battled through the hours when all she wanted to do was go back to bed. It was mid-afternoon, just after she'd put Eva down for her nap, when David drove up to the house. As much as Millie disliked confrontation, she had to have it out with him and tell him what she knew. She came out to the door, crossed her arms and waited for him to come up to the porch. She would have gone out to meet him, but she wanted to stay where she was close enough to hear Eva if she cried out. He jumped down from the buggy. "What is it, Millie? You don't look so happy." "I'm not. I've heard from Meg." "Ah, the postal strike's over?" "It was over weeks ago." "Is it bad news?" He walked quickly to her. "Not that kind of bad news. Not sudden bad news. It's something you should have told me about yourself." He shook his head. "I can't think of anything. What did she say to have you so upset?" "You must know." He shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know what you're talking about. Have I done something to upset you?" "Probably. I'd think Fanny Graber would be feeling sick since you left her. How could you do that?" He stood still and stared at her for a moment before he spoke, and she certainly wasn't going to speak before he did. Finally he said, "I didn't do anything to Fanny. Don't even bother denying it. It'll only make me think less of you than I already do." Her voice raised into a tone she'd never heard before, but the man standing before her made her furious. "What did you think would happen here? Did you think you and I would marry, and what about Fanny? Don't you care about her feelings?" "Well, of course I care about Fanny, but what do I have to do with her? I can't help it if..." Millie gasped. "Do you know what upsets me most?" she asked. He rolled his eyes. "Dare I ask?" "Well, no, you probably don't care because I called you out in your deception, but I'll tell you anyway. What really makes me mad is how you kept this from me when we became close. If you'd told me about it days or weeks ago, then we could have worked something out. At least I would have been prepared." He opened his mouth to speak, but she spoke again. "Do you know how?" She shook her head, upset with herself for having feelings for another man. Joseph would have never kept anything from her. "Is that what you really think of me?" he asked. She stared at him, bitterly upset and unable to speak. "Now can I tell you what the truth of everything is?" He reached out to touch her arm. Slapping his hand away, she said, "No. It's black and white. And I'm just sorry that I was starting to feel anything for you." She took a step back and put her hand on the door handle. He narrowed his eyes. "I had you figured all wrong, Millie Hostetler." "You did, and I you. Goodbye." She turned away from him. "Millie. Wait. You've got things wrong. Can't we talk like two adults instead of you ranting at me like a hissing cat?" She ignored that last bit. "Yeah, I know. I got you all wrong, but now I have things right. I no longer care." For a second time she turned away, and then she walked through the front doorway and closed the door behind her. She breathed out heavily as her body pressed hard against the door. When she heard the horse and buggy moving away, strength left her. Her body sagged against the door and she slid to the floor. Closing her eyes, she listened to his horse's hoofbeats. He was gone, and now she was alone. She pushed herself to her feet and hurried over to peep through the opening in the drawn curtains to watch him leave. If she hadn't found out about Fanny, she might have married him and lived out her days in regret. Moving away from the window, her heart went out to Fanny once more. Why did things have to be like this? Chapter 18. By whom also we have access by faith into this grace wherein we stand, and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. Romans chapter 5 verses 2-5. Over the next few months, Millie had done her best to put David Weir out of her mind. After their argument, he had attended the next Sunday meeting and then he'd left town altogether. Meg had not mentioned him again in her letters, and neither had Millie written about him to Meg. Millie had denied all the help she was offered around her home. She chopped her own firewood, did her own roof repair, and even cleaned her chimney. All that work produced exhaustion combined with a deep-seated loneliness, and led to a feeling of hopelessness. After she stood and stared at the logs of newly delivered wood that needed chopping, she sat on the tree stump clutching the axe, drained. "I can't do this anymore. I need a man, a good honest one. Dear Lord, I didn't realize how hard things would be on my own now that Meg's gone. There are so many jobs to do, so many things would be easier with two. When Eva goes to bed, a long lonely night stretches before me. I long for conversation like Joseph and I used to have. I did like being married. It's so nice to be loved and to love that one special person." She sighed. Was I too harsh on David? The kitten had grown into a cat, and he walked over to her with his long legs pacing back and forth. The cat had become her companion. "Hello, Snuggles." He stopped, looked at her, then turned and walked back in the opposite direction. "Don't be like that, Snuggles." She placed the axe on the ground. Did she expect too much from a man? No one would measure up to Joseph. She either had to live alone or lower her standards. There was no easy answer. Then she prayed again, to finish off the prayer she'd started. "Dear Lord, I want to marry a good man, but there are some times when I'm content to live alone. If it's your will that I marry again, please put a good man in front of me. If no one appears, I'll live with Eva alone, without a father for her and a husband for me. Thy will be done, amen." She tried her best to leave the subject there in God's hands, and she opened her eyes. She blinked hard and then blinked again. Adam Brewer? Sylvia Miller's brother Adam was coming up her driveway in his wagon. She sniffed back her tears and walked over, hoping he wouldn't see she'd been crying. To help matters, she fixed a smile on her face. "Hello, Millie." "Hi, Adam. What brings you out this way?" "I thought you might need some help." He looked at the woodpile and the axe. "Do you need some firewood chopped?" He got out of his buggy. "I certainly do." She giggled, ever so thankful he'd come along. She was dreadful at chopping wood. "Are you offering?" Stooping down, he picked up the axe. "It won't take me long." "That would be wonderful, thank you." "Stand back." A cold wind whistled past them and she pulled her coat further up around her ears. Was he God's answer for her? She had to keep an open mind. Adam was a lot older than she. His wife had died many years ago and he had 2 teenage boys. Everyone in the community thought highly of him, and he was always the first to lend a helping hand to those in need. "How about a cup of hot chocolate for when you finish?" she asked. "I sure would like that. How did you know I was just hankering for hot chocolate?" She giggled. "I'll leave you to it. I'll go inside and make it." "Thank you. I'll be extra fast." She walked inside, hoping this was a coincidence. Now she was in a bind. Had she told God she would accept the man he sent? Was Adam someone she could joke with? He didn't seem like it. Someone like David would have been more her choice, but where had that ended up? When she looked out the window and saw him chopping the firewood, so exhausted was she that she felt she'd marry him for that act alone. At this point she was desperate for help and so lonely for companionship. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and sat on one of the porch chairs with the 2 hot chocolates on a table. As he walked over, he asked, "Where can I put the wood for you?" "It's fine right there." "Are you sure?" "Yeah. I'll move it later. Your drink's getting cold." He continued walking and dusted off his hands. Then he sat down next to her and took up the mug. "Thank you. Thank you for helping out. Who normally does that for you?" "Me." He looked at her in horror. "A woman shouldn't have to do that." She giggled. "It would have been nice to have a man to do all the hard chores. A great many women chop wood. Most of them I know do it, at least some of the time." He shook his head. "I'll do it for you from now on. Let me know when you've got a load of wood come in and I'll chop it all for you." "I couldn't ask you to do that." "Yeah, you could." He swallowed a mouthful. "I'm sorry I haven't got any cookies or cake to offer you." "That's fine." Then he stared at her. "Are you having money problems?" The question took her by surprise. "No, not at all." "It must be hard for you now Joseph's gone." Snuggles appeared on the porch and walked toward them. "Ah, is this one of Sylvia's kittens grown up?" "That's right." It was then that things clicked in Millie's mind. Sylvia had talked about her marrying again. Had she said something to her brother? He'd probably waited for what he thought was a suitable time, and then came offering help. There seemed no other explanation. Adam had never stopped by her place before. The cat smoothed up and down on Adam's leg. "He likes you." Adam stroked Snuggles. "All animals seem to like me for some reason." "Did Sylvia suggest you stop by?" He looked over at her. "I won't lie. She told me you'd consider another marriage." So shocked was Millie that she had to look away. "I see. Would you consider a man like me?" What she couldn't deny was that this man appeared right after she'd asked God to find her the right man. I don't know. What I'm asking is if you'd consider marrying me. Things just weren't right between them. There was no romantic connection. I don't know. I'd have to think it over. I'd want you to be sure. She took a sip of her hot chocolate, wondering if the older man was the answer. He was reliable, he didn't disappear for days at a time, and he showed up to every meeting like clockwork. There would be no question of her moving for love because she wouldn't have to. Can I do anything else for you today? She shook her head. It was only the wood that needed chopping. You showed up at just the right time. I'd run out of steam. Millie giggled. Should we spend more time together? Can I let you know? I've so much I've got to think about at the moment. Yeah. I don't want to rush you into anything. I just wanted to tell you that I'm here and willing to take another wife. It's been 5 years since Marcy went home to God. Now that the boys are older, it's too quiet around the house. I know that feeling. After he finished his hot drink, he didn't stay long. Millie took the mugs into the kitchen and rinsed them out, all the while thinking about the unexpected proposal. After she stacked the wood supply, half in the barn and some in the house, she heard Eva cry. After Millie fed her, she bundled her up and headed to Sue's house, needing some sisterly advice. Chapter 19. Be strong and of a good courage, fear not, nor be afraid of them, for the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 6. When Millie was sitting across from her sister, she unburdened her heart and told Sue everything. I felt like I should marry him for the act of chopping the wood alone. Is that madness? I was so exhausted. She stared at Sue, knowing what she'd say. Absolutely. Absolute madness. You've got to snap out of it. I know, but I don't see how. Malachi can chop wood for you. I can do it. It's okay. See, that's why I never tell you how I'm feeling. I don't tell you so you'll send Malachi over. Adam Brewer is far too old. He's not the right man for you. How do you know for sure? At least he's honest and reliable. I prayed and then he appeared. I said in my prayer, I would put my own thoughts and feelings aside and marry the one he chose for me. What if he's chosen Adam? If you hadn't prayed just before you saw him, would you have thought him suitable for you? No. There's your answer. Millie nodded but wasn't so sure. If there was one thing Millie disliked, it was being undecided about a thing. When she left Sue's place feeling no better, she was drawn to the graveyard so she could sit quietly and in a small way, hope to feel close to Joseph. Eva had fallen asleep in the buggy, so she parked as close as she could to the edge of the graveyard, just yards from Joseph's grave. She sat down on the cold, hard ground, not bothered by the discomfort. I miss you. Nothing's the same. I'm so lonely without you. All she wanted was to talk with Joseph again. If only she could hear the sound of his voice just one more time. She was starting to forget how his voice had sounded. She closed her eyes and envisioned their wedding day. It was the happiest of her life, and every day with Joseph had been so easy. He was such a calm person to be around. Then she recalled the bittersweet day Eva was born. It should have been another happiest, but it was mixed with sadness that Joseph hadn't shared the moment that Eva came into the world. Millie knew it was her lot in life that she had to go on without him, and tears trickled down her cheeks. He says it's okay. Her heart froze. She opened her eyes and turned around to see Sylvia Miller. What is? To love again. She gulped. Sylvia must have thought she was considering marrying Adam. It was the worst time for company. Rarely had Millie felt so low. I'm sorry, Sylvia, but I'm not fit to be around anyone right now. What's the matter? Sylvia ignored her objection and moved closer instead, sitting down on the ground next to her. I can't talk about it. Something's upset you. I'm sorry. I can't even talk about it right now. She wiped her eyes with the end of her long sleeve. You can. Tell me all about it. I'm a good listener, and some say I offer good advice. Against Millie's better judgment, she said, I just feel so wretched. About losing your husband? Yeah, that mainly. Without Joseph, I don't know who I am anymore or where I belong. I feel like I'm a boat on the water bobbing up and down with no oars and no anchor. Floating endlessly, pushed around by every passing wave. How can I be a good mother to Eva when I'm like this? Whenever I think of what a failure I am, it makes me feel 10 times worse. She sobbed into her hands, and then Sylvia put her arm around her and Millie cried on her shoulder. Losing a husband's not easy. I've loved and lost too. Millie stopped crying and sat up straight. I'm sorry. That's right, you have. All we can do is our best. And if you think that's not good enough, it's all in your head. Millie managed to smile when she saw Sylvia's wide and kind grin. Things won't be the same. They never will be. They'll be different, and you have to go along with that and make the adjustments. Millie exhaled deeply. Sometimes I get so tired of everything that I just wish it would have been me who'd died. It wasn't his will. You must keep going until God calls you home. Millie sniffed. I know that, but why does everything have to be so hard? Are you talking about David? Her breath caught in her throat. David? Yeah, I listened to the rumors. People have seen you together. I've upset him and he's upset me. Anyway, he's gone now. Did she know that Adam had proposed to her? I suppose you know that your brother visited me today? No. I didn't. He's not right for you. Millie was relieved to hear that from his own sister. But you see, I prayed for God to find me a suitable man. And you think that man might be Adam? She said it in such a way that Millie felt silly for considering him. At one point I did. He came at the right time just after I'd prayed. And I was so tired and desperate for someone just to help chop wood. Sylvia chuckled. I can understand that. I remember those moments. What about David? Millie looked out at the muddy graveyard across the tombstones through to the trees beyond. I don't know. I feel I'll never really know him. There's a wall between us. With Joseph there were no problems. Everything was easy and uncomplicated. We knew what one another was thinking all the time. We agreed on everything. I don't think we ever even had one argument the whole time we were married. David and I had a big argument because it's a long story. Sometimes a good relationship is one where you can grow. You grow by learning from mistakes. Not understanding someone and disagreeing with them now and again teaches patience and understanding. Millie held her head. Sylvia could be right, but Millie had no energy for any of it. All she wanted was for things to be how they were before Joseph died. You were talking about feeling that you had no rudder. She looked at Sylvia. Rudder? A boat rudder. Oh. I don't know much about boats. I don't even know why I said that, or why I say half the things I do. I was just trying to explain that I feel I'm floating along with no direction, pushed hither and thither. God is our rudder and our anchor, not a man and not a relationship. We get our strength from him. Put him first and what does it matter about the rest? That made sense to Millie in a way, but could she really live like that? She wasn't sure if she had that much faith. Thank you, Sylvia. You're so kind to sit here and talk to me. You've made me feel better. Good. Sylvia laughed. I didn't mean to preach at you. There's nothing more aggravating. No, you weren't. You made sense. I have been too worried about myself and my feelings. I should be more grateful for what I have and help others more. I've a roof over my head, food on the table, and I'm surrounded by friends and family, and I have a darling little girl. You've got a lot. Just saying the words made Millie feel better. I do. Thank you, Sylvia. Millie put both arms around Sylvia and hugged her. What are you doing here? Same as you. I'll leave you be then. Millie was now sorry for Sylvia. She'd had 2 husbands buried in that graveyard and not just one. Sylvia, why don't you stop by my house when you finish and we'll have something to eat? Thank you, but not today. Millie stood. Okay. Sometime soon then, ya? Sylvia Miller nodded. I will. Chapter 20. He that loveth not knoweth not God. For God is love. 1 John chapter 4 verse 8. That night, as soon as Millie had put Eva to sleep, she flopped onto the couch and saw Meg's letter, the one that had mentioned David, peeping out from underneath the Amish newspaper. Feeling she could cope with the finer details of the contents now, she pulled out the letter and decided to read it all the way through. As she read the words from start to finish, she saw how wrong she'd got things. It was David's younger brother who had been engaged to Fanny and had left her. It wasn't David at all. David was involved in what Meg described as some court business, and that was why he was in Lancaster County. Knowing she'd made a dreadful misjudgment, she scrunched the letter in her hands, walked over and threw it in the fire. She said a prayer asking forgiveness for her unrighteous anger. Watching the letter burn, she knew she'd ruined what could have been something special. Just like the paper disappearing into the fire, it was too late to save the relationship between her and David. She sighed. Weeks later, Millie walked into Joseph's old store with Eva in her arms. She'd only come to buy sugar. She stopped still at the door when she saw David. He'd just finished serving someone and he looked up and their eyes locked. There was nowhere for her to run, so she stayed rooted to the spot while he walked over. "Hello, Millie." "And hello, Eva. Look at her, she's getting so big." "What are you doing back here?" "I came to see you." She gulped. "And I came back to look after the store while Hank goes to his brother's wedding." He looked around the store, then he said, "I shouldn't have left in anger. I've been giving things a lot of thought and—" "No, you don't need to say anything. I found out what happened with the whole Fanny Graber thing, and I owe you an apology." He grinned and stared at her. "I'm sorry." "Me too. I could have explained it all at the time, but I was hurt that you would believe all those terrible things about me." She shook her head and looked down. "Those things I said were more about me and my own fears. I'm really sorry." Millie shifted Eva to her other hip. "I forgive you, Millie. I never did tell you why I came here. In the first place, I mean back when we met." As he spoke, someone walked into the store. "Can I stop by after I close up?" She nodded. "Sure." After she bought the sugar, she headed home hoping things could be repaired between them. She'd still felt those butterflies in her tummy when their eyes met. Whatever there was between them, it was worth investigating. While Millie waited for David, she told herself that even if they made up, she would not jump into a relationship. Also, she would not ask him to stay for dinner. Things needed to be taken slowly. Coffee and cookies would be what they'd have, and they could have that on the porch if Eva was asleep, or in the living room so she could keep an eye on the baby if she was awake. By the time David arrived, Millie and Eva had already eaten an early dinner, and Millie had put Eva down on a rug in the living room to play with her toys. Millie showed David through to the living room, where she'd fixed a pitcher of hot coffee and had 2 varieties of cookies. He said a few nice words to Eva, and then turned his attention to Millie. "We have coffee, or would you prefer hot tea?" she asked as they sat down on the couch. "No, I'm fine. I just need to get this off my chest. I've been wanting to tell you for so long." "Go on." He took a deep breath. "I was witness to a crime involving one of my brothers, the younger one. He was being held in jail. I was called to court to give evidence. To cut a long story short, there was a shooting and a man was killed. Evidence pointed to my brother James, and I was one of 2 eyewitnesses, but someone else lied and said James was the shooter. That man wasn't even there when it happened. That's awful. Our parents didn't want anyone to know James was in trouble with the law. The Fishers knew, and I asked them to keep quiet about it. There were all these continuances, and the trial stopped and started multiple times as more evidence came to light. It was a long, drawn-out affair." She nodded. It all fit in with him disappearing and the Fishers acting funny. "How is your brother now?" "He got off and the right man is in jail for the crime. James is back home in Black Creek. He's the one who was engaged to Fanny. They're trying to pick up the pieces now." Millie was pleased for Fanny. How dreadful for him to be involved in all that. These things happen. He got in with a bad crowd and was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's sorted now, and he's come back into the fold. Maybe he had to go through that to learn what's important in life. I'm glad to hear it's working out. Where are you staying?" "The Fishers." "I see. Millie, will you spend some time with me while I'm here? She took a deep breath. She needed time. I'm not sure. How long will you be here? Only a few days. He stood. I'll go now and give you some time to think about it. Okay. He wasted no time in leaving, and hadn't even touched the coffee or cookies. A part of her thought things would be different, and he'd sweep her off her feet and profess undying love. She stood at the door and watched his buggy disappear down the road. Then she closed the door, trying to make sense of everything. Eva was quietly playing with blocks, throwing them, and then crawling after them while Millie sat on the couch to try to figure things out. Placing her stockinged feet up on the table in front of her, she decided she might be able to forgive him, but it irked her that he hadn't told her she'd gotten things wrong. Not that she'd given him opportunity, exactly. He'd just left her alone to think the worst of him. Joseph would never have done that. He would have cleared up the confusion immediately. Things were so hard now. She cried from sheer exhaustion, she cried from missing Joseph, and she cried because now the romance wasn't the same with David. He'd seen an ugly side of her. A horrible, untrusting, hot-tempered side that she didn't want to admit was a part of her. Joseph and she had never had a misunderstanding between them, and that made her think that David was maybe not a good choice for a husband. Then she cried because she felt sorry for herself, and then sorry for Eva. When a loud knock sounded on her door, she jumped to her feet, wondering who it could be. She wiped her eyes with the only thing at hand, the bottom of her apron. "Who is it?" she called out. "It's me, David." She covered her mouth with her hand. Just a moment. She had no time to splash water on her face to cover up that she'd been crying. Her face and her eyes were red, and she knew it. When she deliberated on asking him to come back tomorrow, he spoke up. "Please open the door, Millie." Feeling more vulnerable than she'd felt for months, she walked to the door and opened it. He stared at her. "You've been crying." "I'm okay." She stood in the doorway with one hand still on the door handle. "I know I said I'd give you time to figure out what you wanted to do." "Yeah, that's what you said. Before you do that, I want you to have all the correct information about me." She wondered what was coming next. "Go on." "I'm an honest man and I'm reliable. I always do what I say I'm going to do. I've lived on my own for a while, so I know how to cook and clean and look after myself, but I'd much prefer if I didn't have to." Then he rubbed his chin. "That came out wrong." He took a deep breath. "I'm not saying that's the only reason I want a wife. I'm saying I can manage living on my own, but I don't want that. I want companionship, Millie. A woman who will be a good friend and will trust me completely." She appreciated that he'd come back. It showed that he wanted things to work out between them. "I want to trust you." "I know you do, and that's why I'm telling you this now. I have a lot of good points. I'm a hard worker, and I do everything I can to live a righteous life. Also, there are things about me that I'm trying to work on." "Like what?" "I can be cranky when I'm tired." "Is that it?" "That's all I can think of." She smiled, feeling better. "That's not much if that's your only bad point." He chuckled. "Other people might be better at finding my faults. That's all I've noticed about myself." Taking a step toward her, he asked, "What about you?" "My faults?" "Yeah. I don't have any." He laughed. How about being too quick to judge before you've checked your facts? A sudden temper and..." She raised her hand. "Okay, that's enough." They both shared a laugh. "Millie, I really want you to see the real me. I would have liked you to meet me when I was just visiting, without leaving to go to the court sessions. And I want..." "There's more? What else do you want?" She stared up at him with a hint of cheekiness. "I want you to marry me." She giggled. "You do?" He stared into her eyes and whispered, "I do." "Where would we live?" "Wherever you want." She looked down at the boards on the porch and then looked up into his dark hazel eyes. "Would you want to keep traveling and moving around?" "I've been looking for something to keep me in one place. Why would I have to go anywhere to find that when I've already found it?" "So that's a no." "Yeah, that's a no. I won't move. I'd be content." If you moved here, what about your family? You'd be my family and my most important consideration, you and Eva. She smiled. That was the right answer. We can figure out the rest of the details as we go. I just want you and Eva to be happy, and I want to be your husband. He took a step back. I'll leave you to consider all that. And I'll patiently await your answer. He wasn't Joseph, but just like Sylvia Miller had said, there was room in her heart to love again. Don't go. He smiled and stepped closer. She closed the distance between them. I'll marry you, David. What? I said. You truly will? When she nodded, he took hold of her hands and held them in his. You've made me the most blessed man in the world. I never thought I'd find a woman like you. I'd given up looking. The last thing I expected when I came here was for God to finally answer my prayers. She giggled, remembering how they'd met in the store over the instant noodles. Do you remember how we met? I'll never forget the day. I was behind you when you got out of the buggy and crossed the road. I prayed you'd go into the store. Someone bumped into you and pushed you into the noodles. You saw it all. I couldn't take my eyes from you. I had no idea who you were at the time, but I made it my business to find out all I could. I remember you complained about your hair. It was selfish of me, but I was relieved to learn that you were widowed. I was sad to hear that Joseph had died, but... He put his arm around her and she nestled her head into his shoulder. As she did so, she sent up a silent prayer of thanks to God for bringing him all the way to her community so that they could meet. And for giving David the strength to forgive her for misjudging him. I can't wait to introduce you to my family. I say we get married soon, and sometime in our first year we'll take a trip back there and you can see Meg. I'd really like that. She didn't mind the thought of traveling as long as she had someone to travel with. Do you think Meg will be surprised about us? Millie shook her head. No. She guessed there was something between us. She predicted we'd marry. Tears trickled down her cheeks and he wiped them away. Why are you crying? These are happy tears. He chuckled. I didn't know there was such a thing. Tomorrow we'll see the bishop and talk to him, and then we'll have our wedding published before too long. And then we'll look for some land. Land? She raised her eyebrows. I'd like us to start off our life together in a new house. And I want to build it for us. They hadn't even talked about finances, and she didn't even know if he had the money to build a house or buy land. Will we have to sell this place? No, I have more than enough. More than we'll need to buy land and build a large house to hold all the children we'll have. We can decide later if we want to sell this one or rent it out. She laughed and looked down. We already have Eva, but I hope we will have many more. I'm sure we will. Millie and David married 6 weeks later, and 3 months after that they moved into a brand new house with enough land for 2 large barns and stables and pastures. Millie now had goats and chickens. All Millie had let go of in the past when Joseph had died had been restored. Life with David wasn't one without misunderstandings and the occasional argument, but they always made things right, and learned the art of compromise, even if at times they had to agree to disagree. 2 years after they married, they had a baby boy, and in the following years 2 more boys were added to the family. Snuggles the cat, who had been confirmed to be a male, pretended to pay no attention to each new addition, but Millie knew he was pleased. It meant more people to pat him as he sunned himself on the porch in the summer, or when he curled up on the rug by the fire in the winter. Joseph still lived on in Millie's heart. He was gone but never forgotten. Millie made sure that Eva learned everything she could about her father, and they traveled to visit Meg so Eva could meet all of Joseph's siblings and their children. Years later, when Eva was 10 years old, Meg came to live with Millie and her family. David built an extension onto the house so Meg could have her own living quarters. Eva and Meg were inseparable, and spent many hours cooking and laughing together. They were 2 peas in a pod in regards to personality, and also in looks, with Eva having the dark eyes of her father's side of the family. With Millie's mother having died many years before, Millie was grateful Eva had a close bond with Joseph's mother. Over the years, Millie fell more in love with David than she thought was possible. She often pondered on the scripture in Revelation chapter 21, "And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, And there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. In Millie's darkest days she turned to God, and He turned her sadness into joy. Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your request be made known unto God. Philippians chapter 4 verse 6. Thank you for listening to Amish Widows' Tears.